D'Souza, author of the best-selling books Illiberal Education and The End of Racism. His latest book is The Enemy at Home.
Dinesh D'Souza, at least 3 of your 9 books have really created a controversy over the years. A lot of public reaction. Illiberal Education, 1991, End of Racism, 1995, and now in 2007, The Enemy at Home. What's your purpose in writing these books? Who do you want to influence, and what do you want to have happen?
Well, I think my goal is to take many of the assumptions that are built into sometimes American culture, sometimes into liberal politics, and turn those assumptions into questions. So things that are taken for granted now become open to scrutiny. When I began, for example, Illiberal Education, what we now call political correctness was taken for granted. It was pretty entrenched on the university campus. So by casting a spotlight on it, I made many people look at it and say, gee, is this the way we want to do things on the campus? Is this consistent with what we call liberal education? Similarly now in The Enemy at Home, there's an understanding of 9/11 that became consolidated on the left and the right ever since 9/11, and it hasn't moved. So the debate, I think, has become tired, and clearly the war on terror doesn't seem to be going that well. So what I'm trying to do in the book is to go back to the drawing board, take some of these premises and subject them to scrutiny.
And who are these people that you want to have influence over? Is it the intelligentsia? Is it regular Americans? Is it the policymakers?
It's policymakers to some degree. Abraham Lincoln once said, America is ruled by public opinion. And he didn't mean the opinions of the American public, because the opinions of the American public are only counted once every 4 years or 2 years on election day. What he meant is that there is an intelligent body of opinion. These are the people who subscribe to magazines, go on websites, contribute to various political causes. These are the people who set the parameters of political debate in which the politicians move. So that's my audience. It's the probably 1 million or so Americans who really take an interest in and consequently shape public policy.
Let's just do quickly the 3 books to give people an idea who may not know what they're about. Illiberal Education, again, 1991.
The argument of illiberal education is that in the name of diversity or multiculturalism or fighting racism, universities and colleges are subverting liberal principles. So in other words, universities say, we believe in the idea of equality of rights or equality of opportunity. But the reality is that there are all sorts of racial and gender preferences that are practiced on the campus. Or universities say, we believe in free speech, the open exchange of ideas. The truth of it is you set foot on a campus, and in a way, the more elite the campus, the bigger the problem. You find these entrenched orthodoxies. At the time I wrote Illiberal Education, there were 200 speech codes that were ensconced, that were enforced against students who were hauled up before tribunals and judiciary committees. You said something insensitive and so on. So, and similarly in the curriculum, universities talk about being open to the world, grounding young people in the great ideas of their own civilization. I found out that this was not really happening, and that instead all kinds of ideology was being smuggled into the classroom in the name of enlightenment. So that book was a sort of a close look at several American campuses to show that illiberalism was being promoted in the name of liberalism.
1995, The End of Racism.
That book grew out of illiberal education. In a way, a question that puzzled me is why non-white immigrants to this country do pretty well. And indigenous minorities, I'm thinking here of African Americans and also Native Americans. Obviously, I realize African Americans aren't strictly indigenous. They came in voluntarily as slaves, but I mean, they've been here a long time. Why do the non-white immigrants to America do pretty well, and African Americans not so well? So that was the spark that set off this book. And of course, the topic is inherently controversial. The book came out at the time of the O.J. Simpson verdict, the Million Man March in D.C. So it was a bit of a tense time, although I think over time, the arguments of the book have held up extremely well.
And your premise is that African Americans do this to themselves?
Well, not quite that way, but see, there are 2 theories to explain why African Americans fall behind. One is the sort of the bell curve theory, that there might be a natural or genetic difference between the races. I reject that. The other is the liberal theory, which is that society artificially manufactures these differences. And I show that that's actually not very believable either. For example, you have Asian Americans and whites who score consistently higher on math tests than African Americans who come from quite middle class or even affluent families. It's hard for me to see how racism could create that kind of result. And so in the end of racism, I look at behavioral, which I call cultural, differences between groups. And the book, although in a way a kind of a clear-eyed look at some tough social problems, I think is optimistic because we can't change our genes, but we can change our culture.
And this newest book?
The newest book, The Enemy at Home, we're having this reconsideration of the Iraq debate. But I think we need to go further back to 9/11, because since 9/11, both on the left and the right, you have these very confident explanations of anti-Americanism or the volcano of rage coming from the Muslim world that, in a sense, produced 9/11. On the right, you hear the radical Muslims are against modernity. They don't like science, or they're against democracy. President Bush said they hate us for our freedom. I think that this is all a little dubious. And similarly, on the liberal side, you hear they're upset because we support Israel, or that this is solely a blowback, a backlash against American foreign policy. I think this is equally questionable. I mean, if Al-Qaeda was so obsessed with Israel, why have they never attacked Israel? Israel's right there. And so I think they use Israel rhetorically, and foreign policy is certainly one of their concerns. But I think that if you look at the literature of radical Islam, which I've been doing for the better part of 3 years now, you see a much wider landscape. And that's what this book tries to do. It tries to really open the doors on aspects of this debate that have been completely neglected.
Your supporters, the people who do not like your writing, and yourself have all characterized your writing as provocative. What do you see, what do you consider provocative writing, and where did it come from in your instance?
In my case, my wife Dixie often says to me, she says, I'm very surprised you are the center of all this ongoing controversy. You are not a controversial person. And that's very true. In person, I'm a little diffident. I shy away from conflict. On the other hand, I think I developed a bit of a taste for controversy in college. At Dartmouth, I joined a student newspaper called the Dartmouth Review, and we found ourselves in the teeth of controversy with the college administration. In fact, we used to sort of joke that taking on our paper was like wrestling with a pig. Not only did it get everyone dirty, but the pig liked it. So in those days, as an undergraduate, I sort of relished controversy. But I think my goal today is somewhat different. See, I am both, I'm an immigrant from India. I grew up in a different culture. In this case, a culture that was a mixture of Hindus and Muslims and Christians. And so I'm coming to America both from the outside, and yet I've lived in America a long time, so I'm seeing it also from the inside. So I think this gives my work a kind of two-dimensional quality. And also an independent quality, so that even though I don't mind calling myself a conservative, I don't fit, in a sense, in a very easy way into any particular conservative camp. And in this book, The Enemy at Home, I question not only liberal assumptions, but also some conservative assumptions.
How old were you when you came to the United States?
I had just turned 17, and I came as an exchange student sponsored by the Rotary Club. I lived in Arizona with 4 families. I went to public high school, and that was my introduction to America.
Bombay to Arizona. What was that like?
It was a big change. I'd grown up in a big city, and I had never traveled abroad. I come from a settled community in which I had really not gone many miles from where I was born. So, but someone from the Rotary Club came to our school. I went to a Catholic Jesuit school taught by missionaries, and said, hey, it would be nice to get some of our students to go abroad. It widens their horizons. So my parents thought of it as a one-year program to broaden my outlook. They felt I would come back, finish college, and then go off to England to do graduate work. This is sort of the Indian way. But instead, my high school counselor came up to me during my senior year of high school, and he said, gee, have you ever thought about going to college? He said very few of the kids in our school are even going at all. If you want to go, I'll shepherd you through the process. And that's how I ended up at Dartmouth.
Now, at Dartmouth, you became, as you said, a part of this new newspaper. How did that happen?
It happened purely by chance. I was working for the daily campus newspaper called the Dartmouth Review. I'm sorry, called the Daily Dartmouth.
Right.
And there was a kind of a schism on the paper. The editor-in-chief turned out to be a sort of closet conservative, and so he was writing editorials supporting Reagan. Reagan was then just running for president. This would be 1979. The other editors suddenly discovered the conservatism of the editor. They became outraged. They had a coup and ousted him, and he basically took off and started his own rebel newspaper.
And his name?
And his name was Greg Fossedal. And two or three of us who liked Greg and had worked with him on the Daily D sort of defected and went to the new paper. At the time, I was in no way political. Greg convinced me that the new newspaper would give me a lot of freedom to write. And so it was only when I was at this new paper, the Dartmouth Review, that I met a bunch of students who were discussing a whole bunch of questions that had never occurred to me before. I come from a traditional, Asian American family. My dad's an engineer. I was planning to be an economics major and go on to business school. But suddenly I saw these young people, no older than I was, and they were talking about things like, what is the basis of a liberal society? And should corporations do charity, or are they actually, do they have an obligation to make profits because, after all, they are entrusted with the money that is being given to them by the shareholders? Or questions like, what kind of books should you read to be an educated person? Questions about, Plato's question that knowledge and virtue are somehow connected. So I suddenly realized, wow, these guys seem to have answers to things that I didn't even know there were questions for. So I began to read and expand my mind and plunge into some of the sort of great books of the West. And so I found the liberal education of Dartmouth and sort of my political education developing hand in hand.
A book was written last year, the Dartmouth Review Pleads Innocent. It was about this, and you wrote a section for it, an essay about it. And you talk a little bit about the process or the style in which your group went about trying to change minds. I want to just read this to you and get your reaction. It is foolish for conservatives to attempt to conserve the culture. Rather, he must seek to undermine it, to thwart it, to destroy it at root level. This means that the conservative must stop being conservative. More precisely, he must be philosophically conservative, but temperamentally radical. That is what we quickly understood at the review. We recognized that to confront liberalism fully, we could not be content with rebutting liberal arguments. We also had to subvert liberal culture, and this meant disrupting the etiquette of liberalism. In other words, we had to become social guerrillas, and this we set out to do with a vengeance.
Right. So here's what I mean by this, that, if normally a conservative is a go-along, get-along guy, the conservative conserves. But I raise this dilemma. What if you are a conservative in a liberal society? I don't mean liberal America, but I mean the liberal campus. Then you can't conserve, because if you conserve, you're going to end up conserving liberalism. So my argument was that if you are in a liberal culture, and I want to emphasize one point about this liberal culture, it's the liberalism of the college campus, particularly the elite college campus, is not a function of ideology. When you're a freshman at Dartmouth, you want nothing more than to learn what does it mean to be an educated Dartmouth man or woman. You go to a faculty cocktail party, and so you start talking, let's say, about the communist plot in Nicaragua. The point is, it's not that your professor looks at you and counters you with evidence or arguments. He simply looks askance at you as if to say, are you from Iowa? In other words, he gives you the idea that you're not wrong, you're rude. My point is that enlightenment on the college campus is sort of mixed in with ideological liberalism. It's almost as though in order to be educated or enlightened, you have to move to the left. And many students sort of pick this up almost by osmosis. They begin to identify liberalism with sophistication. That's why to this day, if I go to the college campus, you'll find 19-year-olds draw themselves to full height. Mr. D'Souza, may I inform you? Mr. D'Souza, has it occurred to you? And so on. This confidence comes from their professors who say this is enlightenment. So my point is the conservative is in a dilemma. You have these built-in liberal assumptions that are not just in the classroom, but they're built into the etiquette of liberalism. So my point is you have to change strategy here. You should be philosophically conservative, but ultimately you have to sort of needle and in a Socratic way, in an intellectual way, deconstruct, if I can use that term, the assumptions of liberalism on the campus. And so that we set to do at Dartmouth in a way that I'm still doing in my lectures on the college campus.
And did you do it with your new book?
And in my new book, I do it to a degree, in the sense that what I do is I'll take something that everyone almost takes for granted. The radical Muslims hate us for our freedom. And then I look at the literature of radical Islam and I say, wait a minute, you won't find very many condemnations of freedom in the literature of the Muslim thinkers. What they condemn is the way that we have used our freedom, and moreover they argue that we are taking a set of values, which actually turn out to be liberal values, left-wing values, and that we are imposing those values of secularism, of feminism, values of sort of civil freedom, and we are projecting those values onto the Muslim world. So part of my book is just describing the way in which our understanding of Islam and of the radical Muslims differs from the way that they see it over there. So I'm taking the lens out of the camera, I'm looking at America through Muslim eyes, and here's the irony. In a sense, what I'm doing in this new book, The Enemy at Home, is multiculturalism. But it's authentic multiculturalism. It's challenging ethnocentric assumptions about Islam and trying to see it from the other side, not necessarily to agree with it or endorse it, but say, this will help us have a better strategy. Know thy enemy, and then you can learn to fight him better.
And is it some have said it's a stretch to then say that the left is responsible for 9/11. That from what you just said, to say that the left is responsible for 9/11 is a stretch.
Well, it is a stretch if it is put entirely in that way, in a narrow sense. But I think you need to lay the groundwork for it. Because when I say the left is responsible for 9/11, I certainly don't mean that Hillary Clinton bombed the World Trade Center. What I really mean is that the left put radical Islam in a position where it was able to control a major state, which is Iran, and then later, liberal foreign policy in the Clinton years emboldened these radical Muslims to strike us as they did on 9/11. The radical Islam has been around since the 1920s. For a long time, these guys were holding seminars, they were yelling and screaming in mosques, but they had no real power. They were on the outside. Then in 1979, they got a hold of a major state, which is Iran. And it's important to remember this because Khomeini invented modern Islamic radicalism. Khomeini was the first guy to call America the Great Satan. He was the first guy to call on Muslims to have a worldwide jihad, to commit martyrdom against us. So he set this in place, and to this day Iran is a nuclear irritant. To this day Iran is the model for what the bin Laden guys want. So Khomeini paved the road to 9/11. And a question that we've sort of forgotten in our sort of historical myopia is, how did we get Khomeini? Remember, in the 1970s, America was allied with the Shah of Iran, who was a pro-American ruler. But when Jimmy Carter came to power in '76, his liberal advisors ganged up on him and said, basically, Mr. Carter, you say that you believe in human rights. Human rights was the centerpiece of your campaign. And here we are, America, we support the Shah. The Shah is a dictator. He has Savak, the secret police. So let us pull the Persian rug out from under him. So the Carter administration began to slowly do this. The mullahs began to gain strength in Iran. The Shah pleaded with America, please give me tear gas to dispel these guys, to get them off the streets. The Human Rights Department in the State Department said no. The Shah's position began to weaken. The Carter administration encouraged the Shah to abdicate, which he did. And in trying to get rid of the bad guy, we got the worst guy. So this, in my view, looking back, was one of the worst blunders of American foreign policy in the past half century. And so this is a very concrete way in which liberal foreign policy consolidated for radical Islam its grasp on a first major state.
Now, take that and take a look at what you call what the conservatives should do, because your book really goes into some fairly specific items. First of all, you say that that conservatives need to portray to Muslims that we share common ground and traditional values. And second, you say they need to stop their petty infighting. What are you talking about?
Well, there's a lot of, since 9/11, there's been a kind of conservative confusion, I think, about the nature of this war. There's this idea that there's a clash of civilizations, it's us against them. And the conservative strategy has been fundamentally to do two things. One is find liberals in the Muslim world, and the other is convince liberals in America to join us. I want to suggest that both these strategies have been miserable failures. I mean, we have found the 8 liberals in the Muslim world, and they're on our side, but it hasn't made a bit of difference. Why? Because liberalism, in the modern sense, is simply not a viable political force in most of the Islamic world. Now, the other conservative strategy, which is to convince liberals to come on board, is based on the idea that we'll go to the liberals and we'll try to convince them that bin Laden doesn't really like liberals, that bin Laden is illiberal, which is true. The Islamic radicals are the most illiberal force in the world. They're certainly against feminism. We know what they would do with Nancy Pelosi or Barney Frank and so on. But this strategy has been totally hopeless. It hasn't won any liberals over to the conservative camp, not one that I can count. So I think what the conservatives have missed, or at least some have missed, is that this clash of civilizations is more complex. It's not just us against them. There is some truth to that. But there's a clash of civilizations in the West. Look at the divisions between America and some of our allies in Western Europe. Look at the divisions within this country. I mean, in World War II, there was a moral agreement in America that the war would never end until there were American troops in Berlin. You might debate how to get there, but everyone agreed victory is what we're headed for. There's no other alternative. Now we have a war in Iraq, and there are two camps. One camp is trying to win it, admittedly in a tough situation. There's another faction in this country that seems to be working assiduously, even rooting for us to lose. And I think in a strange way, this faction, which when I wrote this book, which was on the outskirts of power, it had no influence. But now with the Democrats coming into Congress, this left that I'm referring to is whispering daily into the ears of Pelosi or Murtha, a Rangel, a Kennedy. So what was a theoretical fear when I wrote The Enemy at Home, I think is actually now a quite practical problem, which is to say whether the Bush administration realizes it or not, it's fighting two wars, an enemy abroad and in a sense a political enemy at home, which has become the secret weapon of the insurgents in Iraq. What I mean by this is not that there's any conspiracy, don't get me wrong. It's just that the insurgents in Iraq know that they don't have to beat the American military. They only have to hang in there long enough for the left to convince the American people it's not worth risking one more life. It's not worth spending one more dollar. Let's just pull out of there. And that's what gives the insurgents the victory that they could not win on the ground, but are able to win politically.
Dinesh D'Souza is our guest on In Depth this month, and we invite you to join us if you like. Here's how we'll divide up the phone lines. For Republicans, 202-737-0001. For Democrats, 202-737-0002. And for Independents, 202-628-0205. You can also join us by email. If you'd like to email a question to us, the address is booktv@cspan.org. Want to go back, how old are you now?
I'm 45.
And so 9 books, 45 years old. You came to the United States when you were 17. How old were you when you wrote your first book?
Well, my first real book, and I say real book in the sense that a book published by a trade publisher and available in the bookstores, was in fact A Liberal Education. I'd tried a couple of sort of shorter books before that. But
you wrote a book about Jerry Falwell.
I wrote a book about Falwell and the Christian right, a political book, not a religious book. I wrote a book called The Catholic Classics, which was sort of essays on the great books of the Catholic tradition. To be honest, that was an education for me in writing the book as much as it was for the readers. But with Illiberal Education, my first book, I discovered that books have a kind of enduring value that articles don't have. I was a journalist before that. I'd write in a newspaper, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, people read it, the next day they're throwing it out. Even a magazine might stick around for a couple of weeks, but not much longer. Very few people throw out books. And so I realized that a book is a chance to have a more enduring impact. And so since Illiberal, the new book, The Enemy at Home, is my 7th book. And in the unifying theme of my books is the meaning of America. My books on the surface seem to be about very different topics, and they are. But the connecting theme is I look at the great ideas of America, the idea of creating your own life, the idea of liberty, what we mean by equality, equality of rights, equality of opportunity, equality of outcome. These sorts of questions fascinate me, and so I'm sort of unendingly grateful to America to allow me to make a career in which these ideas that have fascinated me since my college days, I can now turn into a way to make a living.
If I did my math right, you were 30 years old when you wrote A Liberal Education.
Yes.
And that would make it 17 years since that was written, and that was a year after you became a United States citizen.
Yes, those were important years for me. In 1991, well, a couple of years earlier in the Reagan White House, I met my wife Dixie, where she was an intern, and I think for a few years in the Clinton regime, she had taken that off her resume, but I think it's back on now. Anyway, we were engaged in 91, married in 92. I published A Liberal Education in 1991. And since then, my life changed. That book created a big sensation. It was 15 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list. And it created a debate that's with us till now. And in a way, the message of that book, which is to question received orthodoxies, not to be bound by the parameters of acceptable opinion, has guided my work ever since. So in that sense, it taught me a fearlessness in confronting issues. Although, unlike some of the bomb throwers out there, I try to do it in a very sober way with a lot of evidence, with a lot of documentation. My book, The End of Racism, for example, literally had 2,000 footnotes. It was a 600-page book. And one of the things that makes me very proud is at the end of that book, there is not a single fact in it that's erroneous. Similarly, with the new book, The Enemy at Home, there's a lot of people, jumping out of windows and screaming at me and so on. But the truth of it is, the book is well documented, and I'm yet to have someone say to me, you say this, but in fact, the truth is the opposite, or the truth is different. So I'm very proud of the fact that the body of fact on which I build my interpretations has always held up very well. And you can disagree with the interpretations. I welcome that. And always have. I spend a lot of time on the liberal campus, actually, almost you could say, inviting intelligent professors and students to debate me and challenge me. A good bit of my time is spent on the road doing that.
What did you do in the Reagan White House?
I was a young policy analyst in the Reagan White House in domestic policy. It was a very strange sensation for me. Of course, I'm part of the generation of young people who came to Washington to be part of the Reagan era. I was writing prolifically articles at the magazine I edited called Policy Review. The Reagan people saw these articles and called me in for an interview. We had a very nice lunch in the White House mess. And I said, gentlemen, I kind of came for the free lunch, but I don't think I can work here. I'm not a U.S. citizen. And these fellows kind of looked at each other, and finally one of them said to me, well, what really interests us is, are you a Reaganite? And I said, well, I am that. And 2 weeks later, I was working in the White House. And so it gave me a window into the inside workings of public policy that I think has been very helpful to my work. I also learned a lot about leadership from Reagan. He's had a big influence on my life.
You, in some of your books, you didn't really like your years in the Reagan administration all that much, personally.
Well, the funny thing was, they were in some ways uneventful, and in other ways hugely eventful. They were uneventful in this sense. I came in 1987, early 87, and I was the teeth of the Iran-Contra affair. This was just raging, and Reagan had been domestically paralyzed. In other words, there was an effort almost to impeach him. And so when I sat in the office, here I was with this big office and all these meetings and so on, and I realized nothing was happening because everything was focused on this Iran-Contra business. And so it was frustrating for me. The other thing that I found odd about Reagan was that he in a sense, was not concerned with small details. I would sometimes be in the back of the room. Reagan would be, would be having discussions and so on. And his aides would be animatedly arguing this issue or that issue, and my eyes kind of connect with Reagan, and I realize he's drifted away. Suddenly he spots the big jar of jelly beans on the desk. He sort of moves them over to his, and he starts, picking them out and sorting them by color. So initially, for a young sort of aspiring intellectual, I thought, my God, we're paying the guy $200,000 a year for what? But then I realized in retrospect that actually I was wrong about Reagan. Reagan had a sort of the long view. He realized that, you can't change the world in 27 ways. Even if you're the president, you can change the world in 2 or maybe 3 ways. He focused on the Soviet Union, on inflation, on taxes. And this very ordinary man, at the end of his 8 years, had achieved an extraordinary amount. I think it was Bob McFarlane, his national security advisor, who once said about Reagan, and this sort of encapsulated my book on Reagan, which was how an ordinary man became an extraordinary leader. McFarlane said he knows so little and accomplishes so much. And this was the great sort of paradox of Reagan. So I learned a lot, even though at the time it was not quite what I expected to learn.
We're going to go to the phones. First call is Homedale, New Jersey. Hello.
Hi. I have to say, the height of audacity on you to say that people that went to work deserve to die because of what you believe. You sound exactly, you are a mirror image of what you just described Osama bin Laden to be. You are as low, and you wrote about Jerry Falwell, you sound just like him. And to say that you went to a Catholic school and were brought up by Catholics, I don't even believe you, because no Catholic sounds like you.
Mr. D'Souza.
Oh, boy. Well, look, on the Falwell business, it's true that after 9/11, Falwell made this, I think, very wrong statement. He said, this is God's punishment for America's sins. And in a sense, he was, you can say, blaming America for 9/11. He was saying that there was divine retribution, perhaps in the manner that some people say, God's punishing the world for AIDS or something. This is not my view. I think God's purposes in the world are inscrutable. I'm not asking that question. I'm asking a different question. Why did the guys who did 9/11 do it? Now, this question is, right after 9/11, there was this gorgeous moment of national unity. The whole country came together. And at that time, nobody wanted to think about this. You basically, was just, let's just find the guys who did this and annihilate them. And I felt that way, too. I wrote a book, What's So Great About America, which is a celebration of America. What's particularly ironic about some of the people criticizing me, this man doesn't like America, this man is in league with bin Laden, and so on. This is the greatest foolishness. I wouldn't have left my family and the world I love to come to this country. I've made a life here that I could never have made anywhere else. So I love America. On the other hand, 5 years after 9/11, it is not unintelligent to say, let's look a little critically at how all that happened. Now, I mentioned earlier the roots about the Carter business. There's something I need to mention about the 1990s. After the Cold War ended, the leading Islamic radicals, bin Laden, al-Zawahiri, and so on, all went back to their home countries. Bin Laden went back to Saudi Arabia. Al-Zawahiri went back to Egypt. They were fighting to overthrow what they called the near enemy, which is their own governments. They saw their own secular rulers as the adversary. They wanted to establish Muslim holy law in their world. But then they made a very fateful decision in the 1990s to shift strategy and attack what they called the far enemy, which is the United States. The question no one has asked is why? Why would you shift from the near enemy, which is your direct problem, to the United States? Now, bin Laden gives the answer. He says, I had 2 reasons. Number 1, I realized the far enemy, America, was propping up the near enemy. Who's keeping Musharraf in power in Pakistan, or Mubarak in Egypt, or Abdullah in Jordan? It's the United States. The little Satan is being held up by the great Satan. But the second reason is, he said, you know, contrary to what everyone thinks, the sole superpower, America, is not so tough. He says, we, the Muslims, discovered this when we fought the Soviet Union. We discovered the Soviet Union wasn't so tough. And he said, and so maybe this United States, for all its bluster, is weak. It's cowardly. If you kick it in the shins, it will turn around and run. And so in the 1990s, the radical Muslims launched a whole bunch of test strikes against America. They tried to bomb the World Trade Center in '93. They attacked our Khobar Towers facility in Saudi Arabia in '95. They bombed our embassies in East Africa. They attacked the USS Cole. Each time the United States government, and this was the Clinton administration, did little or nothing. At one time, Clinton had a perfunctory response, but it was ineffective. And so this confirmed bin Laden in his suspicion of American weakness and cowardice. And he says himself, he says, I was emboldened, one may say, to envision or to think about, to conceive a much grander strike, which is the one we got on 9/11. So this book is looking at sensitive issues, but you can see I'm trying to do it in a way grounded in politics, grounded in history, and yet I have to confront this kind of attack that is sort of implying that here I am with my prayer rug, you know, in bed with bin Laden. It's the most ludicrous thing, but it has become a real blinder in having the kind of debate that a country needs to have to try to understand where it came from and how do we go from here.
Corning, New York, hello.
Yes, I have a statement and then a question to ask the author. The first thing is, I think that religion has been used in the wrong context. I mean, there's always a faction of any religion, whether it's Muslim, Christians, or Jews. You're always going to have a faction that's going to be radical, or however you want to define them. And I think, unfortunately, what happens is people think that all Muslims are characterized as terrorists, or, you know, that, and that's not the case. Most Muslims are law-abiding citizens, and they, you know, go according to their tenets of faith, just like Christians and Jews. And so it's too bad that religion is kind of used in generic terms, so to speak. My question is, how much do you think that this plays in with the argument, and what can we do to try to change people to realize that, you know, that not everybody is a radical just because we label people, so to speak?
Well, I agree completely with the premise of your question. And in fact, I have been fighting some of my fellow conservatives who are very well-meaning, but who derive from the rhetoric of radical Islam and from the sort of Quranic citations of the radical Muslims, the idea that the entire Muslim world is this way, and in fact has been this way since the time of Muhammad. There's all kinds of idiocy out there that basically blames Muhammad as the founder of modern terrorism. Now look, if I had not grown up in a different part of the world, if I had not grown up among Muslims, in fact, the bottom floor of our house was rented by a Muslim family, if I hadn't seen these people up close, I might not have realized what you say to be true, which is that traditional Muslims are very similar in their morality and their outlook to traditional Jews and traditional Christians. Now, the reason this is very important is that I do think that radical Islam has been gaining traction, gaining strength, virtually across the Muslim world. You see it not just in the Middle East, but you see it in Indonesia, in Malaysia, in India, in Turkey. Even today, if you go on a progressive American campus, say Berkeley or Yale, you see a very extraordinary sight. You will see Muslim girls wearing the headscarf. And these are women who are the daughters of venture capitalists and lawyers and doctors, and you would not have seen this 20 years ago. So what I'm getting at here is this. I don't see how we can win the war on terror without driving a wedge between radical Islam and traditional Islam. It doesn't matter if we kill 1,000 radicals if 10,000 traditional Muslims join up the next day. We have been losing traditional Muslims to radical Islam, and every time we attack Islam, we only compound that problem, because if you go around attacking Muhammad or the Quran, you're going to push the traditional Muslim into the radical camp. Now look, Islam has been around for 1,300 years. No one denies that it was conquest-oriented and quite mercenary in its early days. But the truth of it is, Islam has been around for more than a millennium, and radical Islam has been around for a few decades. So I think it's simply wrong to blame Islam itself as the problem. On the contrary, I think we should be finding ways to wean away the traditional Muslims from the radical camp.
In one of your recommendations for conservatives in this new book, you say that they need to retire the tiresome invocation of Turkey as a model for Islamic society. Why?
Well, there's this belief, and it's common on the right and the left, that what we need is to have a secular solution for Islam. All of this is based on a certain paradigm. The paradigm is that the problem here, this war, is a war of two groups of crazy fundamentalists. There are the Muslim fundamentalists over there. There are the Christian fundamentalists over here. These two crazy groups are fighting. What's the solution? Secularism. Secularism at home, secularism for the Muslim world. And what better model for a secular country than Turkey? But now, here's the point. The point is, we are being prisoners here of a certain kind of ethnocentrism, which is to say that Europe and America have become largely secular. But the moment you go outside of Europe, you go even to South America, you go to Africa, you go to China, India, Southeast Asia, the Middle East. These are deeply religious and traditional cultures. When you try to impose secularism on those cultures, you get a certain kind of a resistance. This is not limited, by the way, to the Muslim world. I was recently in Singapore and in India, and a big slogan now throughout Asia is modernization without westernization. And what that means is that we in Asia want technology, we want prosperity, we want capitalism, we want the internet, but no, we don't necessarily want to live in an irreligious society. We don't necessarily want to live in a society in which the traditional values that these cultures uphold are subverted. Many of these cultures are patriarchal. They have the traditional family structure with the male head of the household. My point is there is an aggressive campaign led by the American left and the European left to secularize these cultures. For example, Turkey. The European Union goes to Turkey and says, if you don't liberalize your laws on homosexuality, you will not be admitted into the European Union. Now, my point is the radical Muslims exploit this. They go to the Turks and they say, listen, look at these guys. Basically what they're saying is that as a price for joining the European Union, we should undermine our belief in God, we should undermine the Muslim family, and we should corrupt the innocence of our children. The radical Muslims are exploiting the issue, I agree, but they are finding a receptive ear among traditional Muslims. So not only is no Muslim country going the way of Turkey, even Turkey has stopped going the way of Turkey.
Los Angeles, hello.
Hello, thank you for taking my call, C-SPAN. I'd like to just basically convey how disingenuous your guest is. If you look at what motivated the 9/11 hijackers, specifically the plotters of 9/11, Ramzi Youssef and Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, you can go to representativepress.blogspot.com and see the What Motivated the 9/11 Hijackers video that's linked there in the upper left. It's the U.S. support of Israel's brutal oppression of the Palestinian people. It's not what this smokescreen, this neocon propagandist guest of yours is blowing. It's the U.S. support of what Israel does to brutally oppress the Palestinian people. That was the primary motivation for 9/11, and we're only going to compound this problem as we have aircraft carriers getting positioned to attack Iran in the very near future. Why aren't we talking about the U.S. Air Force planes that are moving into bases in Turkey? Why aren't we talking about the third aircraft carrier, the USS Ronald Reagan, that just departed Lemoore Naval Air Station in California, where I'm actually in Los Angeles? We're not talking about this because the neocon regime that has basically hijacked the Bush regime up at the American Enterprise Institute, where the surge plan came from, as Colin Powell conveyed in Karen DeYoung's, Washington Post editor Karen DeYoung's book, the new bio book about him, the Jinza crowd. The Jewish Institute for National Security Affairs is in control of the Pentagon.
Los Angeles, thank you.
Okay, well, look, first of all, Ramzi Youssef was not a planner of 9/11. Ramzi Youssef is the guy who bombed the World Trade Center in '93. Here's the second point. I do think that foreign policy is important here, but not really in the way that you're suggesting. Bin Laden, right after 9/11, issued what he called his letter to America, dated 2002. In which he very clearly lays out his case against America. He mentions U.S. troops in Saudi Arabia as sort of defiling the Holy Land. But he also mentions a lot of other things that have gone unmentioned since then. He says, Islam is under attack. In fact, he says in another letter, Islam faces the greatest attack, the greatest threat it has faced since Muhammad. Now I ask you, here is tiny Israel in the big expanse of the Arab and Muslim world. In what way does Israel threaten the existence of Islam itself? In no way, in no way. Even U.S. troops in Mecca, there are no U.S. troops in Mecca. The U.S. base has been 500 miles away from the holy sites. U.S. soldiers are by regulation forbidden from having any interaction with Saudi society. I think that when bin Laden is talking about the U.S. presence on the Holy Land, he's talking about more than just the troops. He's saying that American foreign policy is the conduit for secular values. We're propping up the secular dictators over there who are closing the Muslim schools, who are controlling the churches. What they're basically saying is there is an attack on our religion. The reason this is important is think about this. What would motivate a guy from the Sudan or Somalia or Pakistan to be willing to go to his death? Is it that the Palestinians don't have a state? Give me a break. The reason the guy is doing this is he feels his religion is threatened, and there is a call to jihad to defend Islam against what bin Laden calls the global head of the unbelievers. So we're missing this whole thrust of radical Islam's appeal, which is this idea that America used to be Christian, but is now pagan, and is moreover leading some kind of global effort. Bin Laden calls us the head of the snake, trying to ultimately infiltrate the Muslim world and destroy Muslim values. That is what is rallying ordinary Muslims to fight against us.
Our guest is Dinesh D'Souza. The next call is from Adelia, Minnesota.
Hello?
You're on the air, sir.
Yeah, you say the Islamic terrorists started to hate America in 1979 when the Carter administration refused to help the Shah put down protesters. But in actuality, Muslims began hating us when the American CIA, with the blessing of President Eisenhower, overthrew the democratically elected government of Iran in 1953. Now, how do you square that?
Well, first of all, I think you're referring to the CIA coup to overthrow Mohammad Mossadegh, who was the Prime Minister of Iran. But first of all, Mossadegh was not elected by anybody. He was not democratically elected at all. He was appointed by the Majlis, the Iranian parliament, and his appointment was secured by the Shah, who was already in power. The moment that Mossadegh got to power, he declared, in a sense, his goal as socialism, and he entered into a power struggle with the Shah. He dissolved the parliament that had put him into place. He suspended civil liberties, and he was on his way to becoming a dictator. The CIA then orchestrated an effort to overthrow Mossadegh and put the Shah back in power. I went back and looked at this incident very carefully. In fact, I was reading the collected sermons of Khomeini, a very interesting document going back to the 1940s. Khomeini preached 2 sermons, actually thanking Allah that Mossadegh had been deposed. And if you think about it, the reason is obvious. It's that Khomeini was a religious guy and Mossadegh was a secular socialist. So from the radical Muslims' point of view, they were very happy to get rid of Mossadegh, and the idea that that is the root of radical Islam today is completely preposterous.
Where do you read those sermons?
Well, I was sitting out, my wife comes, what are you reading? I'm like, the collected sermons of Khomeini. Well, see, there's a book called Islam and Revolution, published by a fairly obscure press, but it is a wonderfully informative document because it has Khomeini's sermons going back over a period of 40 years. And Khomeini is one of the sort of leading intellectuals of radical Islam, and I think one of the real values of my new book, The Enemy at Home, is it doesn't just skirt the surface and look at bin Laden's 1998 statement. It carefully looks at all bin Laden statements, which are now actually collected. But it also goes back and looks at people like Khomeini, Ali Shariati, Maulana Maududi, Sayyid Qutb, the Egyptian thinker. So you look at the minds that have shaped radical Islam from the beginning, and that gives you a much more comprehensive picture of what these guys are trying to accomplish.
The reviews of your new book have been brutal. Is that fair to say?
I think it is fair to say they've been bordering on hysterical. I even wrote an article about what gets people so unhinged that they begin to attack you. I mean, you see a hint of this with the callers. I mean, personal attacks, which I think go beyond rational discourse and themselves require almost anthropological scrutiny. What is getting people to be so abusive? Which I've seen some of that.
A couple examples from the Washington Post. Warren Bass writes, Rarely has the gap between the seriousness of the issues and the quality of the book yawned as wide. This time, let's just not bother with the flap. This dim, dishonorable book isn't worth it. And from the New York Times, Alan Wolfe writes, like his hero Joe McCarthy, he has no sense of shame. He is a childish thinker and writer, tackling subjects about which he knows little to make arguments that reek of political extremism. His book is a national disgrace, a sorry example of a publishing culture more concerned with the sensational than the sensible.
Now, isn't it lucky I have a bit of a thick skin? But because you're right, there's something very bizarre going on here. I mean, this idea that I'm, a childish thinker. First of all, I'm a fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford. Here's Alan Wolfe at Boston College. So I think what you're seeing here is a certain level of really the lowering of the normal limits of civil discourse. I was talking to my editor at Doubleday, Adam Bellow. We were talking about this common theme that somehow not only is my book wrong, because it might be wrong, in which case you should debate it, but my book is sort of dangerous. This has been the common theme in these reviews. This is a dangerous book. And Adam asked me, he said, Dinesh, what makes a book dangerous? If a book is mistaken, you refute it. It's fiction. You can ignore it. A book is only dangerous when it is unmasking something that everybody wants to keep hidden, or it is demarginalizing an element of the debate that everybody has, or lots of people have worked very hard to marginalize. Now, in a sense, I think what is dangerous about my book is it's pointing to something that is going on right in front of our eyes, but hasn't really been commented on. And that is that there is a strange symbiosis between the enemy abroad, the radical Muslims, and the left in America. Now, here's what I mean by this. On the face of it, these two groups are opposites. The left wants, in general, a permissive society in America. The radical Muslims want to have Sharia, holy law. And yet, in a strange way, these two groups, although they have nothing in common in terms of the kind of society they want, they do have one thing in common. They both, in a sense, will benefit if Bush is humiliated in Iraq. And so they have a common goal. They work toward this common goal in, like two prongs of a scissors. I'm not saying they cooperate in any way. They work independently. But you need both prongs of the scissors to cut the paper. And so the radical Muslims supply the terror, and the left, in a way, uses the terror to convince the American people, let's get out of there. It's not even worth fighting. It's becoming another Vietnam, and so on. So when I hear this kind of stuff like another Vietnam, my ears perk up because, in a way, if you think about it, although Vietnam was a great humiliation for America, a tragic loss of life, and no one supports the loss of life, but politically, Vietnam was very good for the left. And what I mean by that was that not only did the left consolidate a principle it had fought for a long time to accomplish, which is to prevent American intervention abroad militarily for a generation. Vietnam did that. Second, a whole generation of liberal Democrats was swept into office in the so-called class of '74, and some of them, like Chris Dodd, are still there. Third, the anti-war movement in Vietnam strengthened the counterculture. It reinforced the sexual revolution, the civil rights revolution, the feminist movement, the gay rights movement. So Vietnam was not just a foreign policy success or even a political success. In some ways, it was a cultural success. So I think that by pointing these things out, the left is going bananas and, in a sense, is proclaiming me dangerous when they really should be debating me. And that they are not willing to do.
Professor Wolfe also says this, the last sentence of his review. He says, I look forward to the reaction from decent conservatives and Republicans who will, if they have any sense of honor, distance themselves quickly and cleanly from the Rishwain, is that correct? Research scholar at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. I look back at some of your books, and you have some top-level conservatives who have looked at your books: Victor Davis Hanson, Ben Stein, Daniel Pipes, Shelby Steele, here's a couple, Thomas Sowell. Have you heard from these people? Are they continuing your support? I'm
completely in the mainstream of American conservatism. I mean, look, I am, as I said earlier, an independent-minded conservative. So I don't toe a party line. A lot of people who have seen the title of my book think that, and one of the callers even suggested, I'm a neocon, I'm sort of, a shill for Bush. Not at all. The first chapter of this book, The Enemy at Home, is called What Conservatives Know, in quotes, about 9/11 and why it's wrong.
But why haven't we then seen any really pro reviews about your book from more conservative venues?
Well, I have heard from a number of conservative writers praising my book, and of course I've been on many of the leading conservative both TV shows and radio shows where my book is extravagantly praised. In this book, I think I am challenging a conservative orthodoxy about 9/11. The conservative orthodoxy about 9/11 is essentially that Islam is the problem. And what I'm saying is, no, Islam is not the problem. Radical Islam is the problem, and the strange sort of symbiosis between radical Islam and the American left. There's also a libertarian camp on the conservative side that is socially liberal and is in that sense in the liberal camp on the so-called social issues, and is a little uncomfortable with the sort of documentation in the book about the way in which liberal values have produced a blowback abroad.
Has National Review told you whether they will be reviewing your book?
I believe they are, although they haven't yet. I did an interview, a question and answer interview on National Review Online, and I have done that I'm writing a regular column for one of the most prominent conservative sites called townhall.com, and my book has been discussed and debated in just about every conservative venue.
How about Weekly Standard?
As far as I know, the review isn't out yet. The book's only 3 weeks old, and so what often happens is that there's an online debate about it, and then the magazine slowly weigh in. So that hasn't happened yet.
Boston, you're next. Hello.
Hi. Radical Islam, is fundamentally, from my perspective, a function of colonialism. It's a function of totalitarian governments and the economics of oil. And you talk a lot about India. And when I reflect back on India and the independence movement and how after India got its independence, it basically became a state that insulated itself from the rest of the world. And because it insulated itself, it developed its own sense of nationalism. And after that, now, in this century, we have a situation where we have a Sikh prime minister, we have the Congress Party, Sonia Gandhi is a Christian, and our president is a Muslim. But I think that was only possible because the West left us alone for over 60 years until we just became ourselves.
Well, I think that there's a lot of truth in what you say, although remember that the Indian independence leaders, certainly Nehru and others, Gandhi as well, were products of the West. Gandhi was famously asked by someone, what do you think of Western civilization? And he quipped, I think it would be a good idea. And he was being witty, of course, live up to your ideals, but he was also saying, in a sense, that some of his own ideas of nonviolence, and certainly the Indian ideas of democracy, separation of powers, the idea of having a generally secular state, the idea of having rule of law, English as one of the official languages of India, all of this was the product of colonialism. Now, the Indians could have gotten rid of it when we got independence, but chose not to. And so I think in a strange way, if you look at the first generation of Indian independence from 1947 to the last couple of decades, it wasn't that India pushed away the West, it is that India embraced the wrong West. India embraced the socialist ideas that some of the Indian leaders had learned at Oxford and Cambridge, and they started the 5-year plan, and they started, in a sense, socialist types of economics that unfortunately, I think, set India back. It's only in recent years that India has decided to embrace economic liberalism, to embrace capitalism, and in that sense we've been seeing the tremendous gains. But remember, these tremendous gains are not just the product of the last 20 years, they are also the product of the colonial system that brought to India a set of values, a respect for technology, a belief in markets, English as a language. All of this infrastructure has put India in a stronger position today to take advantage of globalization, to take advantage of the technological revolution, in fact, to come to the chance of having a leading position in it.
How old were you in this picture with your family?
In that picture, I was probably 5 or 6, and that's my dad and my mom and my brother and sister. So it's one of our treasured old family photographs.
Where are your brother and sister?
My brother lives in Bombay. He works for a shipping company. My sister lives in the part of India our family is originally from, which is called Goa. Goa used to be a Portuguese colony. And the reason that my family are converts to Christianity going back many generations is the Portuguese Inquisition. The Portuguese basically converted everyone, and sometimes by force. A fact for which, by the way, I am today grateful. I'm sure my ancestors were not grateful for it. But I find many of my values, many of my cherished beliefs, were shaped in this very strange mixture of Western and indigenous Indian culture interacting, not always happily. And so our last name, D'Souza, is Portuguese. My first name, Dinesh, is a Hindu name and means God of the Sun. And so here I am, a product of two cultures and yet really at home in both.
Were your parents political?
Not at all. My dad, an engineer all his life. He died in the year 2000. My mom, a housewife, a school teacher for some time.
Still alive?
My mom's alive, in her 70s. And so our family was educated, English-speaking, middle class. In a way, but I grew up without that exposure to ideas. In fact, a cousin of mine who was a journalist said to me, Dinesh, I'm very puzzled you're in this field. I used to come to your house when you were young. I never saw books in your home. I'm very surprised that you've decided on a scholarly career. And for that, I thank America. That came to me. I thank Dartmouth for it. I thank the sort of world of ideas that has enabled me to shape a very different kind of life in this country.
What was the biggest lesson your mother taught you?
I think ultimately it was that the best way to be happy is to be good. In other words, that there is a hidden connection between virtue and happiness. Not always apparent, and we know from philosophy that this is a subject of huge debate, and it's a debate that fascinates me immensely. But the ancient Greeks saw a connection between virtue and happiness. Aristotle says happiness is the movement of the soul in accordance with virtue. A very provocative argument. We find also in the Gorgias and Plato that it's better to suffer wrong than to do wrong. So I find these things immensely interesting. My ultimate interests are not even political, but I found in politics a way to apply ideas that I've learned in college and learned subsequently. Politics is where ideas meet the ground, and that gives them a certain practicality that I like.
And the biggest lesson your father taught you?
My father was a kind of a very wise man. He was not, as I mentioned, a scholar in any way. He was technically educated. The wisdom that I imbibed from him was more just by being around him. He died in the year 2000, and I flew back for the funeral, and there were about 800 people there, which shocked me, because here I am, a public figure in America, and yet if I pass away, I don't know if I'd have 100 people, let alone 800. So I realized that he had lived in a settled community, but he had in a one-on-one way, a tremendous impact of on a lot of people around him. So he remains a guiding presence in my life.
Chicago, go ahead.
Thank you for taking my call.
Sure.
I just finished Brigitte Gabriel's book, Because of Hate, and it makes a very strong case, a very compelling case, I would say, for radical Islam being really a majority within the Muslim community. And I think her personal experience in Lebanon and some of the things you see happening in Western Europe recently, I think back that up. I think the ultimate aim of the Muslim society is domination, and they may have been in retreat for a few centuries here over their lifespan of Islam, but I think their goals are the original goals of Muhammad, and that is to conquer by the sword, and people will submit or die, and it's ever expanding, and they want world domination.
Well, let me agree with an aspect of what you say and disagree with a part of it. I certainly agree that you are correctly describing the goals of radical Islam. Their goal is conquest, their goal is domination, and they will not hesitate to use extreme forms of violence to achieve it. I also agree with you that radical Islam is pretty strong, stronger than many people think in the Muslim world. The proof of this is that the radical Muslims have been able to win free elections. We saw this with the success of Hamas in the Palestinian territories. We saw it with the recent success of the Muslim Brotherhood in the parliamentary elections in Egypt. So the radical Muslims, by the way, who traditionally were against democracy, you know, bin Laden says we can't let the voice of the people substitute for the voice of God. But some of the shrewder organizations and larger organizations of radical Islam now support democracy. Not because they've been reading John Stuart Mill or the Federalist Papers, but because they've realized that if you have democracy, they can win. Now, on the other hand, I want to disagree with you in this way, that you know, Lebanon is one thing. The Middle East is even one thing. It's not typical of the Muslim world. I don't know if you know, there are almost as many Muslims in India alone as in the entire Middle East. The largest Muslim country in the world is Indonesia. I believe the second is Bangladesh. So you have the Middle East, but then you have another big group of Muslims that live in Asia. You have North Africa. And I think when you go outside the Middle East, you will find a very different kind of Muslim. You speak to Pakistani Muslims, they speak with a British accent, they are very secular, they drink scotch. They're not the type of Muslims that you will encounter in the literature of radical Islam. So let's remember that Islam has developed a quite cosmopolitan civilization historically. In fact, more cosmopolitan than Christendom if one goes back to the Middle Ages. And we should not write off a lot of Muslims who I think would be sympathetic to us if we were to reach out to them. It's only when we attack Islam as a whole that we in a sense play into bin Laden's hands. Bin Laden wants a clash of civilizations in which he can unify the Muslim world and declare that the whole Muslim world is on one side, fighting for Sharia, and the secular pagan West is on the other side, fighting, if you will, for the values of secularism and liberalism.
Asheville, North Carolina. Hi.
Hello. I would like to say I haven't read your book, but it sounds very interesting. And I'd like to revisit some of what you were saying about the correlation between secular left and radical Islam. It seems to me that very often people, they associate radical or fundamentalist thought as some particular aspect of religion rather than a cognitive process that any worldview can go through. I would support this by the number of different experiences that I've had speaking to people of the, to the left, trying to have a genuine debate about ideas and have it very quickly deteriorate into me being called like a homophobe or any other neocon or whatever. I mean, they might as well be calling me an infidel. It seems like that same sort of logic. And when fundamentalism gets identified as an aspect of religion rather than a cognitive process, the answer seems to be, well, let's promote secularism, because secularism doesn't identify itself as a religion, even though it serves a lot of the same capacities. So I guess what I'm saying is that you have radical fundamentalists in this country who don't readily recognize that they themselves are, promoting the same kind of thought process.
Well, I think that the thing to realize is that these terms, like fundamentalism, are Western terms. Fundamentalism is a unique movement that arose within a Protestant Christianity. And so there is a tremendous risk or sort of danger of ethnocentrism when you take a Western term and project it onto a non-Western culture where the term may be meaningless. For example, who is a fundamentalist in Christianity? Well, a fundamentalist is somebody who thinks the Bible is the literal, one may say unmetaphorical, Word of God that should be read exactly for what it says. Now, if you use that definition, every living Muslim is a fundamentalist, because every Muslim believes the Quran is the literal, unadulterated Word of God, not inspired but dictated word for word in the Arabic language to the Prophet Muhammad. if you don't believe that, you're not a Muslim. So my point here is not that the Muslims are extreme or something, but it's that these terms like fundamentalism are not useful terms of classification within the Islamic world. So yes, it surprises me immensely. When we were fighting the Cold War, we understood it pretty well. The Cold War was a fight within Western civilization. Marx was a dead white male. Socialism and capitalism were competing philosophies for which delivers the economic goods better. But now we're dealing with a different kind of enemy that doesn't make its purposes all that clear, that requires a little bit of careful study and certainly a lot of debate. So it really surprises me when people who know no Muslims and very little about Islam so confidently declare Islam is this, the real thing that bin Laden is after is that, and so on. I think we should suspend judgment a little bit and be a little more open-minded and revisiting our own assumptions. This is really the essence of a good education, but the difference is now it has great practical significance. It's not just to get a PhD or land up with tenure. It is that ultimately ideas have consequences, and I think that one of the things I try to do in this book, The Enemy at Home, is show us a better way and a new way to fight the war on terror that can bring us a lot better results than we've been getting so far.
Stockton, California. Hello.
Hello. I'd like to ask the author to address you mentioned earlier in the discussion that bin Laden wanted to or called for the jihad because of the fecklessness of the Clinton administration in the several bombings that took place. I'd like for you to address, because to my understanding, what he seems to say, amongst some of the other things that some of the other callers have addressed that I absolutely agree with, is that American or Western corporations have subjugated the peoples in the Middle East, have stolen their land, exploited the people, stolen their resources, and they have gotten very little in return for the double talk that America seems to be very willing to give to developing countries where it suits Western corporations. Can you please address for me whether or not you see bin Laden as having an axe to grind with that aspect of American foreign policy?
Yes, let's be, I'd like to try to clarify where I think the real forceful thrust of bin Laden's argument is and where it's finding a sort of a receptive reaction in the Muslim world. Bin Laden is not saying that the corporations are coming to the Muslim world or that the American government is coming to the Muslim world to steal land. The reason for that is pretty obvious. The United States actually could steal the entire Muslim world by force, and we haven't done it. Even in Iraq, where Bush invaded, the left in this country said, oh, he's in there to reestablish colonialism, America wants to steal the oil, and so on. The truth of it is, America has invaded that country, but we don't own it. In fact, it's cost us money far more than any oil benefits we've gotten. America doesn't want to steal the oil over there, we just want to buy it. We just want to buy it. Now, here's bin Laden's point. His point is America has set up a devil's deal with secular rulers in that region, which is to say that apart from Iran, most of the rulers in the Middle East are all secular, right? Assad in Syria, Mubarak in Egypt, Abdullah in Jordan, the Gulf kingdoms, the royal family in Saudi Arabia, which is outwardly religious, but in reality quite secular. Bin Laden's point is the West has a devil's bargain with these guys. Essentially, what the West gets out of it is oil, and what the secular rulers get out of it is support. The West is propping these guys up and keeping them in power, and what are they doing? Destroying Islam from within. The secular rulers are controlling the mosques, shutting down the schools, undermining Islam at America's behest. And why does America want to undermine Islam? because it is true Islam that will bring the resistance against this sort of corrupt bargain that is being struck between America and the secular rulers. And you have to admit that there is a grain of truth to this in this sense, that when the Saudi royal family comes to visit America, and if you say to these guys, hey, listen, you're very corrupt, you've been stealing $1 billion here, $1 billion there, their general answer is, well, yeah, so it's either us or the bin Laden guys. You want to get us out of there, you're going to get Al-Qaeda in there. And then the American response is, well, we're very sorry we brought this up. See you next year. Go back to doing what you were doing before. So yes, we are caught in the Middle East in supporting the bad guys to get rid or avoid the worst guys. Sometimes in politics you have to do this. But in my view, the importance of Iraq is that for the first time, America is trying to put a new card on the table. As an alternative to Islamic tyranny of the kind we see in Iran, or secular tyranny of the kind we see everywhere else in the region, we are for the first time trying to create a Muslim democracy. Now people say, you know, and Bush even says, I want democracy all over the world and so on. We're not the world's policemen. Foreign policy is not philanthropy. But I do think that in Iraq we're trying to create not democracy everywhere, but democracy somewhere. And if we succeed, we might be creating a new model that the Muslim world can gravitate toward.
San Francisco.
Thank you very much. I must say, this idea that secularism and civil freedom and feminism and so forth is on the march in the Middle East really comes as news to me. Seems to me that the political situation and economic issues and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict was probably a lot more immediate and concrete for the folks out there. But my question has to do with what I know about Sayyid Qutb, who was, I guess, one of the founders of radical Islam half a century ago. He came to the United States and wrote a book about it and objected to things that he observed here, like jazz and church dances and immodest women and football and the separation of church and state and that sort of thing. And your guest has also mentioned how he thought that it was a mistake not to support the Shah in spite of the Shah's really terrible human rights record. And it just seems to me that those things in mind, the chances of us coming to a position where we're acceptable to the radical Muslim extremists, not the Muslim world in general, but demagogues like Osama bin Laden, is really, really quite remote.
Well, somewhat like the mosquito in the nudist colony, I'm not sure where to begin. You've raised a whole bunch of different points, and I want to try to get at them a little bit. First of all, if you look at the Shah of Iran, he was overthrown not because he was a dictator, but because he was a secular dictator who was trying essentially to take a Muslim country and make it look like Europe. By the way, that was also Ataturk's goal in Turkey. Ataturk came in and had very radical changes in a very short time. He changed the alphabet, he abolished the Muslim calendar, he changed the civil law and imported Swedish and German laws. He not only made the veil optional, he outlawed it. You could not wear a veil or Muslim clothing in a public building. Now my point is, my God, this is a Muslim country. You know, if you brought in Edmund Burke for 1 minute here, he would be having an epileptic fit. Burke's point is you cannot change a society by fiat. And Ataturk was able to get away with it in his lifetime because he was the Turkish Gandhi, the liberator of Turkey, and so on. But even now his changes are being reversed. The Shah was just too much. And so, yes, there was indigenous Muslim resistance, but the Shah was strong enough that he could have defeated it. My point is, in that situation, in politics, you are often, it's not like a seminar. You're not choosing between the good guy and the bad guy. Sadly, you are choosing between the bad guy and the really bad guy. And so sometimes you have to make those difficult realpolitik choices over there. But look, you raised this issue about liberalism. Let me tell you this. In my book, and you should read it, because in the book I document a very aggressive campaign by international leftist organizations to push liberal values abroad. I'm not saying we should change our way of life over here, no. But I am saying that groups like Planned Parenthood International will boast on their own websites, oh gee, we're opening up clinics in all these countries, we're handing out condoms to teenage girls. Now look, in America, it's safe sex, no big deal, and so on. In some countries, we have to do it. There's problems of AIDS and so on. But you go to any traditional country, go to any part of the Muslim world, not just the Middle East, but try Turkey or Indonesia or Bangladesh. You start handing out condoms to unmarried girls, and you will have a riot on your hands. These are cultures that value modesty, chastity, virginity before marriage. So what I'm saying is, while the left is accusing Bush of foreign policy imperialism in Iraq, the left has its own campaign of cultural imperialism that is being very vigorously prosecuted under the radar screen. And so I think one of the reasons the left is so mad is my book blows the whistle on this.
And you are specific in terms of leftist organizations. You list them in your book. Here they are: Act Now to Stop War and End Racism, Answer, United for Peace and Justice, Peaceful Tomorrow, Open Society Institute, National Lawyers Guild, Human Rights Watch, Center for Constitutional Rights, Amnesty International, Ford Foundation, Code Pink, Planned Parenthood, American Civil Liberties Union, National Abortion Rights Action League, and People for the American Way, MoveOn.org.
And their behavior is detailed in the book. In other words, I'm not just coming up with a list. See, had I just said the left, the left, the left, people would say, well, who are you talking about? So it's important in a book like this to give chapter and verse. I point out, for example, to step outside the Middle East for a moment. As we speak, there is a very vigorous campaign going on in South America, led by these NGOs, non-governmental organizations, and UN-affiliated groups, to go to high courts in these South American countries and overturn restrictive laws on abortion. Now, in fairness, these laws are restrictive. I might not support them myself to that degree, but these are Catholic countries. They are also democratic countries. The laws have been passed democratically. So what these international groups do is they say abortion is an international human right. And any country that has restrictive abortion laws is in violation of international human rights law. Now, in reality, that is completely bogus. If you look at the human rights listed in the UN Charter, you will not see abortion. In fact, you see the opposite, preserving the family, and so on. But in the name of rights, and I think bogus rights, the left is going to these countries with a lot of money and a lot of lawyers and arm-twisting these countries into changing their ways. What I'm saying is, it's one thing to say we should change our life, which we should not. But I think it's important to say, when people on the left talk about diversity, multiculturalism, respect for the integrity of other cultures, and so on, shouldn't we ask, how is that consistent with this aggressive political campaign to override the moral sentiments of traditional people and force them to accept a set of rules not of their making? I think that this is actually pretty scandalous, and in that sense, I'm not concerned with the radical Muslims. I don't care about them. We can't persuade them. We have to shoot them. But there are traditional Muslims, and we hear so often, why won't the traditional Muslims speak up? Why don't they condemn the radicals? And true, they're strong enough, they could defeat the radical Muslims by themselves. But I think the reason they don't do it is the radical Muslims have successfully portrayed America as a pagan, immoral society. And so in distancing themselves from the radicals and the violence, the traditional Muslim doesn't want to be on the side of paganism either. So he keeps quiet.
Pinehurst, North Carolina.
Yes. First of all, I am going to be on the side of you, sirs. You've taken a few shots this morning, but I'm really a fan of yours. I have a liberal education, and I'm going to get your new book. But my question is, when you're talking about secularizing, I'm sorry, I had a stroke, but the conflict, why don't we take some time and go back to the Constitution? How do you feel about that? Because the Constitution, whereas most people would agree that it's a Christian organization, but yet the First Amendment is entirely secular if they read it correctly, and it's very tolerant.
Well, you're actually raising a question that interests me a lot. I'm working on a short book to come out this fall called What's So Great About Christianity, in which I do want to explore the complex relationship between Christianity and, for example, ideas like separation of church and state. You have to remember, separation of church and state, which we consider to be a Western or an American invention, the idea of separation is in fact in Christianity. When Christ says, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's and render to God what is God's, he's making a conceptual distinction between the realm of government and the realm of the church. Now, the American interpretation, or our current idea of separation of church and state, is a quite radical one. I think it goes beyond what the American founders intended. In fact, strangely, it is more radical than anything even in Europe. In England, as we know, there is an established church, the Anglican Church, and so the English model is establishment with toleration. Even in secular countries like France or Germany, which are more secular than America, the government gives money to religious schools and so on. So when you look at the American understanding of church and state, it is anomalous even in Western civilization. And therefore, I think it is foolish to take that as a universal model. In a way, Bush had to learn the hard way in Iraq. The moment he said we want democracy in Iraq, America picked the most secular guy, Alawi, and said, you know, vote for this guy. And the Iraqis said, you know, no, thank you. We'll take the religious guy, Jafari, or this new guy, Maliki. And the Bush administration wisely acquiesced in that outcome. So I think we've got to realize that if we want democracy, we have to let Muslim countries be Muslim, govern themselves, and allow the traditional values of Islam to govern those societies. And people say, well, what do you mean? Are you saying that we should have Sharia in Iraq? Doesn't that make Iraq a theocracy? Well, there's a big difference between the Iran-style imposed Sharia and in Iraq, where you have an election, men and women can both vote. It would be one thing if the men voted to put the women under Sharia, but the women and men both voted for a government that campaigned on having some form of Sharia in domestic law, not in everything. So I wouldn't vote for it. I don't think you would vote for it. But hey, if they vote for it, it's their country. Let them have it.
Las Vegas, hello. Go ahead, Las Vegas.
Hi, good morning. My question has to do with American history. What I hear seems to be mostly 90s rhetoric with very little understanding of American history. It's as if you're looking through a glass darkly. You know, Aristotle said, he who knows only one side of the case knows little of that. When I went to school at UCLA in 1970, if you made one spelling error, you got a grade taken off. Things have changed in schools and schooling since then with regard to your Stanford fellowship. So my question to you is, how much understanding do you really have of Americans in America? You know, it was Ronald Reagan who brought those troops to Lebanon that really started all this, because the minute those troops were blown up, we were in a 2,500-year-old jihad that we knew would never end, we as American people. But the president did as he saw felt, and we're feeling it still today.
Well, with regard to American history, it's I have written extensively about American history. The reason it interests me so much is that my own life has been so intertwined with the idea of America. In my book, What's So Great About America, you'll find it's basically a book about history. It asks, what is it that makes America unique in the world? And I think what makes America unique in the world is the idea of the self-directed life. In other words, the life in which we are architects of our own destiny. If I had stayed in India, if I had never come to America, people say, immigrants come to America to make money, to get rich. And I think there is some truth to that. America obviously offers a lot of opportunity. But I grew up in a middle-class family. If you ask me, is my life economically better in America? Yes, it is. But it's not such a radical difference. My life has changed more in other ways. If I stayed in India, I would have probably lived a short distance from where I was born. I would have married a girl of my identical caste or socioeconomic or cultural background. I would have probably become an engineer like my dad, or maybe a doctor like my uncle. And I would have a whole set of views that could be predicted in advance. So to me, by coming to America, I'm able to become the architect of my own life. My life is more like a car, and I am in the driver's seat of it. And my major decisions in life, where to live, who to love, who to marry, what to become, what to believe. These are decisions that we as individuals make for ourselves. Now, this is the great legacy of the American founding. It was not realized at the founding. The founding installed the principles of it, but it was realized through the Civil War and the Civil Rights Movement. I'm very grateful, for example, to Martin Luther King for having opened doors for me as a non-white immigrant that would have been closed had I come to America, say, in 1940 or 1910. So look, I am immersed in American history, and I agree with you. The world has changed. Our education system has changed. I also think the really big change has been in the moral sphere. The moral consensus that held America together from the founding all the way to World War II. When we speak of the greatest generation, in a way we're speaking of the last generation to believe in this idea of an external moral order that makes demands on us. Today we have a different idea. It's sort of not the morality out there, but the morality in here, the morality of the inner self. The self as the adjudicator and sort of umpire of moral decision-making. So this is a big shift in the source of morality. And so I'm very interested not only in the way that plays out in America, which is what we call the culture war, but the way in which these same ideas are projected abroad. So one of the themes of this book, The Enemy at Home, is that the culture war and the war on terror are not two separate episodes. They actually are linked. They are part of the same struggle, and only by understanding the connections between the two can we fight both wars more effectively.
You dedicate What's So Great About America for Danielle, who will one day understand. Who is Danielle?
Well, my daughter Danielle and my wife Dixie are sort of the center of my life. Danielle is 12 years old and in the 6th grade. And going to school in California, where we live. Danielle is, I dedicated it to her because she will be growing up in America. And in this book, which is perhaps my most autobiographical book, I say more in it about how I came to believe the things I do, how my life has been changed by America. Edmund Burke once said, to love our country should be lovely. And what he means by this is that real patriotism isn't just, you know, my country right or wrong, or if you don't like it, get out of here. One of the reviews of my book by a guy in Esquire magazine, he goes, you know, if Dinesh doesn't like America, ask him to leave, this sort of thing, he hates America. This is stupid patriotism. I try to defend a different kind of patriotism, which is loving America in the face of critics of America, facing up to what people say is bad about America, but saying that, hey, look, although this may be true and that may be true, at the end of the day, America meets the Burkean test. America deserves our love and allegiance because it not only gives us the good life, which we enjoy, but it makes possible for us to live the life that is good. So I think that I want Danielle to grow up learning that lesson, and so I dedicated that book to her. If I may tell a little funny story, my current book, The Enemy at Home, I dedicate to my in-laws, Jim and Gloria Brubaker. And so at Christmas, while I was unveiling the book and showing them the new dedication, Danielle comes scampering into the room, and she goes, Dad, what are you saying? Grandpa and Grandma are the enemy at home? So I said, no, I don't think that did not enter my mind. So anyway, you know, I think partly as a parent in America, one begins to be a little more aware of certain elements in American culture. I love American culture. I'm immersed in it. But there are certain elements in the culture that when you have a young daughter about to enter her teenage years, you begin to realize are somewhat toxic. You have to almost block your child's eyes and ears from them. And this alerted me to the fact that if I, in America, find these things, and not only that, but in America, I can make a distinction. I see popular culture, I go, gee, that's a bit too much, but that's not the way Americans live. But then I think of the ordinary Muslim walking on the streets of Islamabad or Cairo. He sees some of these same values of our popular culture. He doesn't know that there's another America that lives totally differently. To him, these values are America. So I see the way in which these ideas can be easily exploited by the radical Muslims saying, look, this is what these people stand for. They are utterly without shame. Look at their television shows. When is the last time you see someone ever go to church? Look at the people having sex. They're never married, or if they're married, not to each other. So my point is, our popular culture, we have to admit, gives a distorted picture of America abroad. I think we could actually blunt the appeal of radical Islam, not try to convince them, but blunt their appeal if we would show the rest of the world the other America. The Americans who work hard and go to church and look after their families and live by traditional values. This would appeal to the traditionalism of non-Western cultures and undermine bin Laden's argument that we're some kind of atheist, immoral society, which we're not.
Where did the "who will one day understand" come from?
I mean, I made that up. I composed that. Danielle is of an age where she comes to my lectures and is curious but uncomprehending. In one of my lectures, I make the joke. I say that, I was talking to an acquaintance in Bombay who wants to come to America, and he can't get a visa. So finally I asked him, why are you so eager to come to America? And he goes, gee, I just want to move to a country where the poor people are fat. So this is Danielle's favorite line, but I think it's all that she retains from my speeches at her age. I think as she gets older, she'll be a little more immersed in these issues. So that's why the one day understand, I'm looking to a future moment when actually, as a dad, I can actually talk to her about these issues.
When you appeared on Booknotes in 2001, you talked about her playing chess. Why is chess important, and why did you teach her?
Well, chess is one of those games, well, invented in India. And I think a very good way to form one's mind. I learned chess when I was very young. My dad taught me. He was not a good player, but he taught me how to play. And subsequently, I became very fond of it. I'm a good player, but not a terrific player. When I was in Washington, D.C., a bunch of us, in fact, Charles Krauthammer, the columnist, Charles Murray, the author, me and a couple of others, we set up what we call the Pariahs Chess Club. Pariahs Chess Club, because all of us are controversial writers. And so we played once a week or so. It was a great source of joy to me. Dixie, my wife, plays, and so very often chess is sort of one of those family activities that we do periodically. And it's a lot of fun, and it develops the mind.
Caribou, Maine.
C-SPAN, thank you for the willingness to show a guest like this. Of course, he's brilliant, and most of his ideas, books like his, would be blacklisted for most of the other networks. So thank you very much for the breath of fresh air. I'm an ex-leftist and ex-leftist activist, sir, and a lot of what you're talking about is exactly why I'll have no more to do with them, some of the trends that you've clearly discussed. But as an independent today, and I recognize the same quality in you, as an independent, I want to challenge you. It's been said of you by many of the, like the folks Susan was quoting earlier in the reviews, it's been said that you've said too much. On the contrary, I don't think you're saying quite enough, so I'd like you to either agree with a couple of brief propositions or tell me why you don't, okay? The first is that the attacks tend to multiply approximately tenfold every few years, that being 3,000 casualties recently, and so the next attacks, looking at it historically, one would figure would have approximately 10-fold casualty figures. My theory is that will not be enough to really do away with some of the harmful dynamics you've discussed. It will take the next stage beyond that, in which we would be looking at probably close to 100,000 casualties. That's the first proposition. The second is that we're not using a term that is the only appropriate term that should be used, that we need to start using because it's becoming more and more appropriate, and that's the term collaborator. If you had asked 100 Vichy French collaborators, of course, whether that's in fact what they were, not one of them would have admitted to it. Many of them wouldn't have even realized that's what they were doing, but it doesn't matter. Of course, they still were collaborators. Many on the far left today are serving the same purpose, and is it not appropriate, in fact necessary, for us to start using that word in order to flesh out and also do away with some of the things that will destroy the country, if not stop?
Dinesh D'Souza.
Well, I don't use that term, collaborator. I don't know if I would, if I like it. I also, by the way, I want to say that I do defend the left against the charge that the left hates America. In fact, some of my friends on the right have attacked me for this. There's a whole camp there, the liberals hate America. I think this is stupidity. The liberals don't hate America. Now, the liberals do oppose conservative America. There are many on the left who don't like traditional America. They don't like the America, they may not like some of the American founders who they see as slave owners. They may not like the Boy Scouts. They may not like they don't like the Daughters of the American Revolution, too traditional, too elitist. But on the other hand, they have their America that they like. They like the America of the suffragettes. They like the America of the slave revolts. They like the America of the civil rights movement. They like the America of Roe v. Wade. They like the America of gay marriage. So they will defend liberal values. And I think in a way, they don't see themselves as helping the enemy. They see themselves as working, in a sense, to defeat the greater enemy, which is Bush and his conservative and religious right allies. Think about it this way. If you are a liberal, and at one time liberalism and the left, they were the party of the working man. They were the party of unions. But today, liberalism and the left is not the party of unions anymore. In some ways, the so-called sexual issues have come to center stage. These now define the things that the left will fight for. They get very animated when those values are threatened. So ask yourself this, who is threatening liberal values in America? Is it bin Laden? No. Bin Laden may want to have Sharia in Baghdad, but from the left's point of view, Bush wants to have Sharia in Boston. And so Bush is the near enemy. The Islamic radicals are the far enemy. And so the left says, listen, which is more important? To defeat those guys over there or to defeat this evil guy Bush over here? If you listen to leftist rhetoric, they don't like the radical Muslims. You'll see things like, of course, bin Laden is not a nice guy, and so on. But when they talk about Bush, a certain pathological hatred comes into their voice. They talk about he's evil, he's destroying the Constitution, he's the worst president ever. So the differing decibels of rhetoric show what I call the indignation gap. They are upset about the foreign enemy, but more indignant, more determined, more resolute about running Bush and the religious conservatives out of Washington. Now, your other question, I'm a little more fuzzy on this business about the great strike against America. I'll put it a little differently. I think that in trying to get rid of Bush, the left is playing with fire. They're playing with fire because the radical Muslims have controlled one country, Iran, for a generation. They have been trying desperately to export Islamic radicalism to other countries. They have failed. Iran is a very peculiar country. It's Shia rather than Sunni, and 85% of Muslims in the world are Sunni. Second, ethnically, it is Persian and not Arab. So because of its peculiarity, the Khomeini revolution has been problematic but localized. The Islamic radicals are very eager to get their hands on a second major state, Iraq. They would like to create a Sunni model that the rest of the Muslim world can follow. They have already said that if they get Iran and Iraq, they will target Egypt and Saudi Arabia. So, look, this is not Vietnam, some faraway country where our interests are not directly involved. In Vietnam, we lost. It was very bad for the people over there, a bloodbath in Indochina, but our interests were not directly affected. By contrast, if we lose here, I think we are jeopardizing our economic welfare. I mean, it's simply a fact that for the foreseeable future, we're dependent on Middle Eastern oil. And we are also jeopardizing our own security, because once the radical Muslims consolidate over there, you can be pretty sure they're going to be bringing the battle in a big way over here.
Our guest on In Depth is Dinesh D'Souza. We'll be back to take more of your phone calls in just a few minutes.
Dinesh D'Souza writes his books at his home in Rancho Santa Fe, California, near San Diego. C-SPAN talked with him there about his writing process.
A typical writing day for me starts early in the morning. I usually get up about 5:30 or 6. I check my emails and get some of that out of the way. I then take my daughter to school, which is 8 o'clock, and then I begin my writing after that. So the mornings are, for me, the most productive time. I'll usually write for 3-4 hours straight, and that's the bulk of my writing for the day. Sometimes if I have an article on deadline, I might pick it up again in the afternoon or later. But otherwise, I leave the afternoons for phone calls, interviews, research, and then I do my reading in the evenings or when I travel. I use a very old-fashioned and primitive style. I know there are lots of people today who have 30 windows on their computer, and they have quotations that they drop into articles as they write them. I don't do that. I read books, and while I'm reading them, I take a pen and I brutalize the book. I write down, I write markings, I write in the margins, and then I have my research assistant copy all the pages of the books I have written in. Then I take that material and organize it into themes or chapters. I take the quotations that I might use or the data that I might cite, I put it onto note cards. So I have a large table in my office, and I then very systematically lay out the material that I'm going to use in the sequence that I'm going to use it. So by the time I sit down to write a chapter, I already have an intellectual picture of how the chapter is going to unfold. And then as I do each section, I fish out the relevant section of quotes and citations and references. So so by the time I'm ready to write, a lot of the work that goes into the book is already done. My editor is a longtime confidant and friend and collaborator, and I even call him a co-conspirator. His name is Adam Bellow. He's the son of the novelist Saul Bellow. And Adam is a very thoughtful, learned. He's very interested in politics, but he's not that political. His interests are more philosophical. He's a wonderful editor for me because he gives my work a lot of depth, and he pushes me to follow the train of an argument. And so, for example, if I say, the radical Muslims seem to be upset at America, not just because we support Israel, but they call us an immoral, decadent society. They say we're an atheist society. Adam's question is, well, are they right? And if I say, well, there may be some truth in what they say, the next question is, well, how did we become this way? Who has made America an atheist society? Who are the people who are pushing that agenda here in this country? So between Adam and I have a kind of a dialectic going throughout the book. We usually sit down and chat about the idea. Then I develop the argument. I send him chapters as I write them. I get feedback on a pretty prompt basis. So oddly, unlike authors who sometimes finish a book, send the whole thing in, and then the editor responds, you may have to rewrite the whole book. In my case, I'll have sent in the chapters, so by the time I get to the end, the book is already edited. It's ready to go. Adam published my first book. He was then at the Free Press. My first book was called A Liberal Education. I've done several books with him now, although he has moved to Doubleday, where he's currently an editor, and Doubleday is the publisher of my current book. So I've got a very long-standing and good relationship with Adam.
We're back with Dinesh D'Souza on this month's In Depth. Mr. D'Souza, Richard Dawkins, why does his name come up on your list, not only of what you're currently reading, but also your favorite authors?
Well, I think that I value good writing and clear thinking. And also, if you think about my career, I'm operating in the gap between academia on the one hand and, you may say, public life on the other. What I try to do is I take ideas that are complex, rooted in history. My work is interdisciplinary, and yet I'm not writing for fellow scholars exclusively. I'm writing for a general audience. My book's always readable. I try to make them not only intelligent, but entertaining, so that you, in the process of learning, enjoy reading. So I identify authors, and I don't care what their politics are. Like Stanley Fish is a good example of a professor at Duke. We've debated 5 times. He came to my wedding. We've become friends over the years. We're on opposite sides politically, but we get along. Dawkins I've never met, but I immensely enjoyed his book, The Selfish Gene. And I've come to admire some of his work. In some ways, I'm now writing against some of his ideas. But I admire his determination and intellectual force, clarity of his ideas. In some ways, I feel like I'm working in the same genre. And so I would cite him as being on the opposite side of the fence, but we are on the same side in terms of valuing clear thinking, good writing.
Currently, you're at the Hoover Institution.
Yes, I am.
What is that?
The Hoover Institution is called a think tank. It's a research foundation, a research institute, founded to honor Herbert Hoover, former president. It's part of Stanford University, although governed, I believe, autonomously. It has its own board. It's governed by the director, John Razian. It's a wonderful place. It has a fantastic archives where you can get, particularly on things like the Cold War, wonderful treasure trove of information. It's a very interesting community of scholars. We had, until his death, Milton Friedman, George Shultz, Tom Sowell, Shelby Steele, and many others. Interestingly, at Hoover, we have a lot of disagreements, too. For example, if you look at the war in Iraq, we've got one resolute camp that is for it. We've got a camp that's very uneasy about it. Not uneasy about it for reasons given by the left, but disagrees with the strategy of it. So I find Hoover to be a very invigorating and lively place, and it gives me the independence to do my work, and then also to go out to the American campus and engage these ideas, debating with professors and so on. It's an important part of what I do is to sort of take these ideas abroad, if you will, and take them particularly to young people whose minds are just being formed.
On your website, people can read a list of all the places where you're speaking. If I counted right, you have 14 speaking engagements within 1 month.
Yes, part of it is I'm on the book tour, so life is a little more energetic. But I am on the road a fair amount. See, here's the thing. I find that a lot of conservative students on the campus are so beaten down. They feel so besieged. Very often on a big university, they will find they're lucky to have one professor who will publicly identify with them. So here you have these colleges which are doing backwards somersaults to create diversity, racial diversity, gender diversity, religious diversity, every kind of diversity except the one kind that you think would matter most in an intellectual community, which is diversity of ideas. So I go speak on the campus, and even liberal students come up to me and they go, "Oh my gosh, we have never heard these ideas." And I say, "Yeah, but you're at Yale, you're at Princeton. These are the great swirling issues that are being debated in Washington. They're shaping our world. What kind of an education are you getting if I don't care what position you take about these issues, but you should be aware of the strongest arguments on both sides." So I think that this is so I almost do this as a bit of a public service in the sense that I am often, verbally assaulted by the radicals. I've had all kinds of episodes with people dragged out of the room, hecklers and so on. I just spoke at the University of Wisconsin at Madison, and sure enough, I had some people yelling at me and so on. But by the end of the talk, a number of people who I think were in the middle said, "Gee, there's a lot here I'm going to have to go home and think about."
Have any universities ever tried to keep you out, keep you away from speaking?
It's quite rare. It has happened to me once or twice. I was scheduled to speak, for example, at the Lakeside School, which is Bill Gates' alma mater in Seattle, Washington. And a little cabal of teachers got together. I don't think they actually read any of my books, but they went on the internet. And if you look at my controversial books like The End of Racism or even my new book, The Enemy at Home, you find that the ratings are in extremes. People either give me a 5, they love it, or they give me a 0. They hate it. And so in that sense, they went on some of these sites. They got this idea of what I was going to speak about, and then they went to the headmaster and said, if you let this man speak, we will resign. Typical intimidation move. Typical, listen to us or else. This is the authentic voice of the left on the campus. The head of the school, who was a nice guy, had heard me speak, knew that it would, in fact, he brought me to campus because he said, you will bring a point of view our students never hear. Seattle is a very liberal community. But he had to weigh the pressure. On the one hand, disinviting me, annoying, he'd still have to pay me. On the other hand, you got these professors who are calling him a racist and challenging him, threatening him, they'll leave. So he acquiesced to the pressure. This is the tale of the invertebrate administrator. Alas, I wish some of these guys had a little more backbone.
Can one make a living just speaking?
Yes.
Is it a good living?
In my case, I think that what I wanted to do with my life was to find a way. I mean, this is the thing I saw in college. I saw all these ideas. They fascinated me. In India, I always loved language, literature. I always saw it as a hobby. There's just no way to make a living with it. But in America, I said, it would be amazing if I could take these things that I would do in my spare time, that I would do for fun, and make a life out of it. So I'm paid a base salary at Hoover. I write books that have been successful. My new book is basically just touching the bestseller list now. It'll be my 4th book on the New York Times bestseller list. And
which one has sold the most so far?
Well, book sales have gone up over the years. Illiberal Education was 4 months on the bestseller list. The End of Racism was a bestseller. What's So Great About America was a bestseller. In fairness, some books are also a function of timing. Sometimes a book comes out and my book, The Virtue of Prosperity, which I think is a fascinating book about how capitalism has won the economic debate but not the moral debate. The book came out during the Florida recount. I was bumped off all the television shows, but that you win some, you lose some.
Would you tell us how much your base salary is if you were to go to a college campus or a private organization or business?
Sure. I charge $7,500 to give a talk. Mm-hmm. That's my speaking fee. And I speak, I would say, 60 or 70% at universities and then about 30% at business groups. They're very different, actually. The business groups, people generally listen to me and they go, yeah, makes sense. What do we do now? I find almost unanimous agreement with the things I say, even from people who are Democrats. The universities are very different. People are less interested in solutions. They want to argue about, is slavery responsible for the decline of the black family? We get into all these historical, anthropological, economic debates. I find both very exciting in their own way. And so speaking is a lot of fun. Although I don't like the travel of it, and I certainly don't like being away from Dixie and Danielle.
When were you at the American Enterprise Institute in Washington?
I was there since at the end of the Reagan years. I came to AEI. I was actually getting ready to go join the Bush administration, which was George Herbert Walker Bush, the father. Mm-hmm. But the head of AEI, Chris DeMute, came to see me at the White House, and he said, you've been at the White House, you've got a White House credential. You're a very young guy. You're not even 30. Why stay in government? What are you going to learn over there? You've learned about public policy. Get out. Come to AEI as a young scholar. Write some books. Develop a field of expertise. Make a reputation. And although he was paying me half of what I earned at the White House, it was a very wise career advice, and I took it. So I came to AEI right after the Reagan years ended, and I was there for 10 years, or a little more than 10 years, actually. Yes, 10 years. But then we wanted to move to California. My in-laws live in California. Our daughter was 4 years old at the time. Dixie grew up in California. She's a California girl. And so she's always wanted us to move. I didn't see how it was possible. I was living in D.C. I was a public policy writer. But this is where technology came to the rescue. I realized, oh my gosh, I can do this. And so we packed up and moved. I stayed as a non-resident fellow at AEI for a little while. But then the Hoover Institution came knocking and said, gee, we're in California, you're in California, doesn't it make sense for you to come on board? And so I did.
During your time at AEI, you wrote this book, The End of Racism, and 2 of your colleagues at that time, Glenn Loury and Robert Woodson, left the advisory board because of this book.
Right.
How do you feel about that?
Well, it was a very, it was kind of a traumatic episode at the time because this was really my second book. I'd learned a lot from Glenn Loury in particular.
Let me just stop you right there,
Yes.
because in 2002, he came here for a Booknotes interview, and he talked about the controversy. I want you to listen to what he says and respond to it. Here
Sure.
he is.
That happened in the fall of 1995. The book had been published. I wrote a review for the Weekly Standard of the book that was critical, and then there was a kind of firestorm, and I decided, along with Robert Woodson and another African-American on the sort of right-of-center spectrum, to step down from the American Enterprise Institute's Board of Advisors because of my feeling that I just didn't want any longer to be associated with the Institute, given the kind of work that they were putting out.
And what was so bad about it?
Well, D'Souza, who is a successful journalist, writer, and a good writer, had written a popular book about racism that I felt was so contemptuous in its language and its use of example and so on, its characterization of African-American community life, the reasons for our marginality and so forth. It was so disrespectful. It had an air of a smart alecky sneer about it, in my judgment, as I read it. And it was so weak, again, in my judgment, as I read it, in the substantive quality of its argument, so full of historical inaccuracy, of exaggeration, of sort of only a kind of one-sided characterization of the story, that I thought it really reflected very poorly on the American Enterprise Institute, and I thought it actually set us back with respect to race relations, because the book was relatively popular and seized upon by people as an exemplar of the... So I'll give one example. D'Souza argues in that book that, well, if you're a taxi driver, you wouldn't stop for these young black men either because they're thugs. Well, true. If you're a taxi driver and all you can see is the color of a man's skin, you're going to take note of the fact that disproportionately people who ride taxis tend to look like this and not like that. They're not old white women. They tend to be young men of color. Therefore, you might be more wary when you encounter one than the other. But that can hardly be the end of the story. Why would I use that example as a way of, in effect, justifying racism? He says it's rational for the cab driver to avoid. Well, that's not the end of the story, and in my own book I discussed that example. I can say more about it if you like, but I simply want to say here that D'Souza's book was full of kind of half-thought-through argument about race, all of which seemed at the end to come around to supporting this particular view, which is that the blacks have done it to themselves. Let them stew in their own juices. America's a great and open society, and the best way to get beyond race is to stop talking about it. And I just think that was wrong.
Dinesh D'Souza, do you have any regrets about what you wrote in The End of Racism?
I actually don't, and let me say why. First of all, there are no historical inaccuracies. If there are, I mean, Glenn didn't point any out. Here's the thing. Glenn was actually in the process of breaking with the conservatives. It wasn't just over me. Glenn Loury was good friends with Charles Murray. Charles Murray at the time was at the American Enterprise Institute, and a couple of years before me, he had written The Bell Curve.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Glenn Loury was in an position because he had co-authored with Charles Murray, and so he was very reluctant to speak out against the bell curve, although he was very disturbed by it. He submitted a couple of things about it that were rejected, so he felt mistreated by the right. Glenn did. When my book came along, it was like the next train coming into the station. Now, I will say one thing about The End of Racism. One thing, having grown up in a different society, coming to America, I look at this issue without, if you will, I don't do the sort of backward somersaults a lot of people do when they talk about race. A lot of people attend their racial discussion with immense artificiality. They do little pirouettes. They say some of my best friends are black. They do all this nonsense, basically trying to establish their goodwill before they are given a chance to speak. I, in a sense, violated this taboo. And I said, let's just look at this thing, let's raise the curtain on these taboos and look at them in a serious but honest way. Now, the example Glenn gives is perfect, because I said, we assume, ever since the Civil Rights Movement, that racism is based on prejudice. Discrimination is based on prejudice, which is an irrational judgment about a group. But I said there are two kinds of discrimination. There's discrimination that is based on prejudice, and there's discrimination that is based on a conclusion. In other words, groups do differ. And when groups differ and behave differently, it is sometimes rational to treat them differently. A classic example is that you can step outside of race to get a little bit of clarity on this. Insurance companies will charge more money for auto insurance rates to young boys than young girls. Now you can say, this is sexist. Well, it's not sexist, it's based on the behavioral differences between boys and girls. Quite frankly, young boys are more likely to bash their cars. Now, you can go to the insurance company and say, I'm a young boy and I'm an excellent driver. They don't care. You belong to this group, boys, that as a group behaves badly. Now, here's the point. I said that if you look at racism today, many of the examples given, banks are more reluctant to lend to African Americans than to whites. I say, okay, but let's look at the way that real estate values have held up in black neighborhoods versus white neighborhoods. If there is a difference, banks would have a rational reason, not a moral reason, and I'm not saying it should be legal, but I am saying they would have a rational reason to discriminate. I use the cab driver example because everyone can identify with it. Here in Washington, D.C., there are very few white cab drivers, and yet there have been lots of articles about this. You talk to the West Indian immigrant, you talk to the immigrant from Haiti, you talk to the immigrant from Korea, and they all say they are more reluctant, they are fearful of picking up the young black male. So I say, why is that? Is that because they have internalized white racism, which is the old model of prejudice? Or do they know that the crime rate of young black males, alas, is 8 to 10 times for violent crimes higher than that of young white males? Now, to say this is to raise a depressing reality. I am not happy about it. But in the book, I am simply pointing to, in a realistic way, a real social problem and offering real solutions. I think you can't fight rational discrimination the way you fight irrational discrimination. Because with irrational discrimination, you simply have to show the person you're acting in an irrational way. In rational discrimination, the more you convince them, the more they see that their actions make sense. So you need a different strategy. So unfortunately, because the bell curve had raised the issue of genetic inferiority, which I don't agree with, Glenn Loury and others were painting my book as pointing to cultural inferiority and saying it's all of a piece. Whereas in reality, I was making a very different point. In a multiracial society, we can learn from each other. We can look at ethnic groups that have overcome discrimination, have grabbed their share of the American dream. The African immigrants are a classical example. I saw an article not long ago, West Indian immigrants achieve income parity with whites. Amazing. This is a group darker skinned than African Americans, but it has higher savings rates, higher rates of entrepreneurial formation. There are rotating credit associations to generate capital. So the book, The End of Racism, it's a tough book because it looks at a tough social problem. I don't do the pirouettes, and I think that's why the book generated this visceral reaction. But it was also tactical. I mean, Glenn Loury was not at the American Enterprise Institute. People felt that, we were neighbors, and, the truth is he was on some committee. He was on some list. He decided to get off the list and use that to make political hay. And all right, that's the way this politics is played. But I think that the conclusions of the book, if you were to read it today, you'd say a lot of it that was so controversial 10 years ago today is almost part of the conventional wisdom.
Briefly, can you just explain that cultural difference that you mentioned in one of your books? In India, there wouldn't be a sense of, can you explain it to me, a sense of self-doubt, a sense of that we find so much here. Is that correct?
Yes, I think that one of the aspects that makes the black experience unique in America, different than the immigrants, by the way, is not just the history. Blacks came in chains and the immigrants came generally voluntarily. It is that when you are dealing with racism in the white-black sense, you are dealing with what one writer called rumors of inferiority. People may not like immigrants, the Pakistanis or this, the Muslims or that, but no one really thinks that they're inferior. The suspicion of inferiority is what distinguishes the prejudice against African Americans. One of my arguments against affirmative action is that far from remedying that suspicion, it intensifies it. Essentially what it does is it puts an invisible question mark or quotation marks around the achievements of all African Americans. And this, I think, is really terrible. To back up a little bit on this debate, a long time ago, there was a great debate in America between Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois about how a group like African Americans, that are starting at the bottom can move up the ladder. And basically, W.E.B. Du Bois, who was the first black PhD from Harvard, said blacks face one problem, and that's racism. They should fight that. The solution is to agitate, 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 Frederick Douglass's phrase. Booker T. Washington said no. He said, look, racism is one half of the problem we face, but the other is black cultural disadvantage. He says, I admit this cultural disadvantage can in many cases be traced to the historical effects of racism, but he said it takes on a life of its own. So that even if you have a civil rights movement that says, okay, we are now going to have equality of rights under the law. Everyone gets the right to compete in the race. Yes, but you have to have the skills to succeed in the race. What's the point of having the right to a job in General Motors if you can't do the job? What's the point of having a right to go to Microsoft if you can't program? So my point is, Booker T's point was, we need the rights, but then we need the developmental skills to take advantage of those rights. So I see the civil rights movement as having created the necessary conditions for success. But unfortunately, a generation later, we're still following the W.E.B. Du Bois strategy, agitate, agitate, agitate. Jesse Jackson, Al Sharpton, all these guys are out there. Whereas in reality, the immigrants, the non-white immigrants, are following the Booker T. Washington model. Yes, we have the rights, thank you very much. But now, we need education, we need to have close family structures, we need to find a way to get credit, we need to invest in entrepreneurship. So let us use the opportunity in America to claim the American dream. And that's why the immigrants are coming from nowhere, not speaking the language, with no credit. They move to the inner city, and in 15 years, they've already moved into the suburbs.
Let's get back to the phones. Kylene, Texas.
Yes. I'd like to start off by saying that I'm a Salafi Muslim, and we are sometimes referred to as Wahhabi because of the revivalist Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, which you cannot attribute a whole religion to that person, but he was just returning Islam to what it was during the time of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, as far as the ideology goes. Okay, the main important point in Islam is ifradullahi bil ibadah, which in English translation of the meaning means to single out Allah for worship. And that has three aspects. You have one, which is rububiyyah, which is singling out Allah in the fact that He is the creator, the sustainer of everything in existence. And the second part is, because of that, He's the only one you should pray to, sacrifice for, ask for help from the unseen, swear by, have reverential fear of, have absolute trust and reliance on. And the last point is that we cannot refer to Allah except what He calls Himself in the Quran, or the example of Prophet Muhammad, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. May Allah's peace and blessings be upon him.
Caller, can I ask you to get to your question, please? We have a lot of people in line.
Well, I just wanted to clarify some issues because I would just like to clarify some things, because there are a lot of people coming on bashing Islam, and you don't have enough people on there to clarify what Islam is. Like, say, for instance, the man Fareed Abdullah, who is an imam in Los Angeles, who is a graduate of Islamic University, who is right here in the United States. We need some people to clarify some issues instead of always attacking Islam, saying that, you know, the terrorists this and the terrorists that. The terrorists, we're not afraid of the terrorists, but the terrorists do not listen to the what's in the Quran. They don't listen to what's in the Hadith of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, so they're not going to listen to us.
Caller, who do you think is the best spokesperson for Islam, for your Islam, for Wahhabi Islamism?
Well, first of all, that's a wrong clarification or saying of what the word is. The word is a Salafi. The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, said he was a good Salaf for his daughter Fatima when he was talking to her at the end of his life. Okay, the best spokesperson in the United States who has a command of the English language and the Arabic language would be, in my opinion, Fareed Abdullah. He's an imam in Los Angeles, California.
Okay, thank you.
Look, I think that one thing I take from your comments is I do think that we have in America a very poor understanding of Islam. I do think that there are important differences between Islam and the West that do need to be highlighted. For example, in Christianity, the martyr the term martyr is common to Christianity and Islam, but is understood very differently in the two religions. Because Christianity began, one may say, in defeat, with the persecuted Christians being pursued by the Roman Empire. The idea of the martyr was the sacrificial lamb, the Christian fed to the lion. In Islam, it's very different. The martyr is a guy who got on his horseback and went out to fight for Allah, to extend the empire of Muhammad and Islam, and died in battle. That's a very different understanding of martyrdom. Similarly, church and state. As I mentioned earlier, in Christianity, there has always been a conceptual separation. Even in the medieval times, even in the time of the Spanish Inquisition, if you committed blasphemy, you were tried by the church, but if you committed murder, you were tried by the state. So there's been this distinction throughout Christendom, or Western civilization. Whereas in Islam, from the very beginning, church and state were united. Muhammad was not only a prophet, but a Caesar rolled into one. And therefore, Islam is, in a way, a religion more of law than of creed. In some senses, when we talk of separation of church and state, it's possible because you can privatize a creed. You can practice your religion in private. But if your religion is one of law, it's senseless to talk about privatizing your religion, because your religion, by necessity, has to influence, one may say, the organs of government and society. So I think that these are some genuine differences that we should be aware of. But I also think that there is a lot of foolishness that is said about Islam, particularly about traditional Islam. I want to make one point at this here, and that is that very often the radical Muslims who know that in the classical Islamic tradition, Judaism and Christianity are treated as precursors to Islam. Just as in Christianity we think of Christianity as incorporating and, one may say, superseding Judaism, Islam sees itself as incorporating and yet superseding both Judaism and Christianity, so that Moses and Christ are prophets in the Islamic canon. This is why the radical Muslims are extremely insistent that they are not fighting against Christianity. When they use the term crusader, as bin Laden does, he always means a pagan crusade. It is key to their argument that the West used to be Christian, but has now relinquished Christianity and is now pagan. The term the Muslims use is jahiliyyah. They mean the ignorance and polytheism that the Prophet Muhammad encountered in the Arabian desert with the Bedouins. And Islam has always taken a very dim view of polytheism and paganism. The basic idea is you have to respect fellow monotheists, but when it comes to non-believers and pagans, all manner of force is permitted.
San Diego, hello.
Yes, Dinesh, like you, I feel all the contradictions in the current political and cultural scene raised a conservative Catholic in a waspish Protestant country here with Southern and Eastern European parents, and then becoming more of a libertarian and trying to understand what my way of life means to my country and my way and the world at large. I think I sympathize with your position, but I'm worried that Islam, as you've just stated, is really a 500-year-old, very fundamentalist, although you somehow resist that term in some contexts. It's a very fundamentalist and inherently radical regime that would end up more like the Japanese kamikazes heading for the West Coast in 1945 if they had had a nuclear weapon. If we let these countries like Iran and other countries have their way, I think we're going to end up with kamikazes heading for this country with their nuclear weapons, and we don't have time for them to bridge the 500-year enlightenment that has modified the religions of the West. So you really cannot give these people the opportunity to take over countries, even with the moderates that you say are lurking there ready to take over. I'm really worried, Dinesh, that we're in a culture war, that we cannot take prisoners, and the first WMD that goes off in this country will suddenly bridge the gap with enlightenment. Germany and Japan found out that you shouldn't mess with a free country, and they ended up devastated. Now, the Middle East radicals may end up in the same place. Please comment.
Well, I think that you have to remember that you're right. The United States basically wiped out Germany and Japan. If what you say is true, we have before us a somber task, and that is fundamentally wiping out 1 out of every 5 people on the planet. There are 1 billion Muslims in the world, 1 out of 5. Can you imagine what it would even take for the United States to declare war on Islam itself? This to me is madness. Moreover, we are divided in this country now in a way that we weren't in World War II. There was a moral consensus in World War II that is not there today. In World War II, there were the same mistakes made, worse. The wrong places bombed, strategic blunders, friendly fire, a refusal to plan for what came afterward. Everything that is said about Iraq was true 10 times over in World War II, but nobody cared because the whole country was agreed that this war will only end in Berlin. This will only end with unconditional surrender from Japan. Now, we now have a country which is fighting in a very divided way. And can you imagine if on top of that we were fighting the entire Muslim world? I think, sir, you are setting forth a recipe for failure. I think that we are better off identifying the radical Muslims who are just as dangerous as you suggest and have exactly the aspirations that you talk about. And if they could get their hands on a dangerous weapon, would do exactly what the kamikazes would do with it. So it is all the more dangerous that these people, who I think are a significant minority in the Muslim world, I don't want to guess or bet, maybe 30% of the Muslim world, not terrorists, but maybe sympathize with radical Islam, but they have been recruiting from the ranks of traditional Islam. We are losing traditional Muslims to their camp. So if we don't find a way to stem that flow, if we don't find a way to wean away traditional Muslims from becoming radical Muslims, I fear we are lost.
Ella J., Georgia.
Thank you, Connie. Love C-SPAN. Just want to say, Dinesh, Ronald Reagan's my hero. In fact, I've endorsed Romney for president because he reminds me of Reagan. But what has happened to the Reagan agenda? All the pork barrel spending, the farm subsidies, all the waste. What would he say if he was alive today to see how the Republicans have, had all the unbelievable pork barrel spending and waste of taxpayer money?
Well, I think he would shake his head and say, there you go again. I mean, the problem is that that Reagan came in, and Reagan brought with him some very radical ideas. If you think about it, the great idea in the 20th century was collectivism, an expanding government. And even Republican presidents, from Eisenhower to Ford to Nixon, had made their peace with an expanding welfare state. Reagan, I think, when he said government is not the solution, government is the problem, was saying something truly revolutionary. Also, when I first came to America in the 70s, the public ethos had been set by John F. Kennedy. Basically, John F. Kennedy said, if you're young, if you're idealistic, if you care, do what? Join the Peace Corps. Become a public servant. Reagan challenged that idea. To him, it wasn't a public servant, it was the bureaucrat. And Reagan said, it's not the bureaucrat who sits around basically writing memos, doing nothing. It's the entrepreneur who is the embodiment of American possibility. So I think that Reagan produced in America not just a political shift, bringing the top tax rate from 70% to 30%. Not just that. It's a cultural shift in which we now live in America, where the entrepreneur is the embodiment of the American dream, not the bureaucrat. Now, having said all this, I come to your point, which is that, yes, I think we've lost sight of sort of Reagan's big-heartedness, his self-deprecating humor, his optimism about America. I have tried hard in my life, even looking at difficult problems, to embody that kind of optimism, even when people are yelling and shouting and calling me names and so on. The thing about Reagan is he had the Reagan doctrine. And the Reagan doctrine is very simple. Let people fight for their own freedom. We don't fight. We help. When the Afghan Mujahideen were fighting to push the Soviets out, the Soviets were shooting them out of the sky with helicopters. Reagan said, we're not going to send troops. We'll send some Stinger missiles to shoot down the Soviet helicopters. It's your country. It's your freedom. You fight. So I'm saying that today, adapting Reaganism to our time, we will win the Iraq war, not when we end the insurgency, not when we end terrorism, no. But when the Iraqi government is able to defend its own freedom, its own sovereignty, when the insurgents will still be there, but when Iraqi forces can fight them, the Bush doctrine, which was sort of invade, is now gradually replaced by the Reagan doctrine, which is let the Iraqis defend their own freedom.
Santa Cruz, California. Hello.
Hello, Mr. D'Souza. In your latest book, you give a number of statements which really are very good examples of Hitler's big lie technique. Are you familiar with the big lie technique?
I have heard of it, although not a practitioner of it.
Well, the idea is if you tell an outrageous enough lie, more people will believe it. It sort of short-circuits their rational thinking. You have one big lie on the cover of your book, but another one, which I want to deal with, is where you say that liberals want the United States to lose the war on terror. The war against terrorism is the way you say it. What do you mean by that?
Sure. Well, the book is actually full of examples and documentation of it. I'll give a few from memory. Michael Moore on his website said that the insurgents in Iraq are not terrorists. They are not the enemy. They are the patriots, the Minutemen, and they will win. It's very clear that whose side that guy is on. Right after the United States invaded Baghdad, one of the editors of one of the prominent websites, Salon.com, basically wrote and said, you know, I've been rooting for America to have more problems over there. I just wish the Arab world would fight harder. I just wish they would rise up in rage. Right when some American contractors were killed in Iraq, they had their heads cut off. It was put on the internet. You couldn't imagine a more gruesome killing. Marcos Moulitsas, who is the head of dailycost.com, one of the prominent liberal websites, says, who cares about these guys? They're part of the American war machine. Basically, screw them. What I'm saying is when you listen to this, it's, you know, you get a very clear sense that what's going on here, and there's a whole rhetoric behind this. If you read the works of not only Noam Chomsky, but Howard Zinn and others, their idea is that America is the largest force of terrorism in the world. Their view is that the terrorists are minor league players. The most people killed have been killed by American foreign policy. And so in a way, from the point of view of the radical left, there is a war against terrorism. It's fought against American foreign policy. And so if you imagine that these guys are on America's side, they want America to win, they want Bush to win in Iraq, their actions are totally incomprehensible. You have to draw elaborate diagrams to explain what they're getting at. On the other hand, if you change the assumption and say, look, they're rooting for Bush to be defeated and humiliated. They would like to see Iraq become a millstone around Bush's neck. They would like to see the Republicans run out of town. Their actions make perfect sense.
When you are responding to your critics, you many times say that they have taken you out of context. How are we to know that you do not take folks out of context as you're quoting these and just what you just said, the examples that you just gave?
Yes. So the thing is, you know, in some senses, in a certain sense, all quotations are out of context in the sense that to have the context, you'd have to reproduce the whole book. Right. But a quotation should be true to what the person meant and accurate in what they said. Now, when I cite quotes in the book, in every case, someone can say, look, I quote this. The context is why the person meant something different. This never happens. This caller is typical in this way. It's a big lie for me to have a title that says the enemy at home or the cultural left. It's not a big lie. It's an argument. You may agree with the argument. You may disagree with it. It's very carefully set forth in the book. So a disagreement is not a lie. And similarly, when I cite evidence, you may not accept the evidence. You may think there's counter evidence on the other side. In a sense, my book is trying to argue a point. It's not sort of one of these sort of Buddhist on the one hand, on the other hand. I'm making a polemical argument. But a good polemical argument will take into account rival evidence on the other side. Someone mentioned earlier, you say that Carter sowed the seeds of 9/11. Now, what about Reagan? Because Reagan withdrew the Marines from Beirut. Reagan traded arms for hostages. I deal with that in the book. I say, yes, true. Was this a mistake on Reagan's part? A huge blunder. Should Reagan have traded arms for hostages? No. But at that time, the radical Muslims were preoccupied. They were fighting to push the Soviet Union out of Afghanistan. And strangely, we were helping them. The United States was backing the Mujahideen, so that was not the root of 9/11. Stupid policy? Yes. Cause of 9/11, no.
South Bend, Indiana.
Oh, how are you? Dinesh. Yeah. Listen, I have a problem with you because when you talk about the end of racism in America, you have, and this might be kind of strong, a racial pathology. And the reason I say something like that is because you talk about foreigners who come here and who succeed in America. And the thing is that black people have been successful in America. We've tried that. You know what I mean? The thing is, black people have only been citizens in this country for 42 years. We've only really been protected under the law for 42 years in this country. So when you tell us that you have some kind of understanding we've already done it. So, and for you to sit there when you come from a country like India, you know, people who don't know about the untouchables, could the untouchables just jump up and just say that one day, okay, we can just get over this? The untouchables in India couldn't do that. You have to put us in that same frame as African Americans in this country. And I see that you're nodding your head right now. You know this is true.
Yeah.
So,
let me ask you, have you read my book, The End of Racism?
I'm going to be quite honest with you. I know you can throw that out.
No, I'm not throwing it out.
No. I have not read it. I'm not going to say, but I have seen you speak on several occasions.
Okay, here's why. Because we're really not, if you take my book as basically saying, gee, you know, game's over, time for blacks to shape up, you know, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying this, that after, like you say, blacks tried very hard, and one of the very frustrating things about trying very hard when the rules are rigged against you is you develop the idea that this is the wrong way to go. Because you're right, the system is blocking you. And so when the system changes, I mean, remember, America's a different country now than it was 50 or 75 years ago. And there are avenues of opportunity today that weren't there then. So my question is, given that, when African Americans do have opportunity today, why is it by a great tragedy of history that not the African Americans who have been here for 100, 200, 300 years, but the newcomers, the non-white immigrants, come dancing in, often not speaking the language, and they are grabbing their share of the American dream? I can see why the ordinary African American is frustrated, because blacks should be doing better. And so my book is a way of saying, listen, let us debate in a multiracial society what is the best way to get ahead for a group starting out at the bottom. That is the spirit in which the book is written.
South Bend, do you have a reaction?
Yes, I really do, because that's fine. And it's fine for you to sit there and say that, but we've been here for 400 years. We are tired of people saying, well, now is a new day. Now you can go ahead and... We've been here already. That's the money. Listen. White people had the money. That's what it boils down to. It doesn't boil down to anything else. I don't care about you. It's idiots out here who have money and control their environment. It's about money. The civil rights movement was great, but we went through it politically because we had no other choice. We tried to build businesses. They shut us off. That's why reparations, and it may sound crazy to a lot of people listening on the phone right now. It might sound crazy, but if you're going to try to tell me that these people who had the money illegally, if you ask me, you had the money. White people had the money. These conservative people had the money. Give us the money. I don't care about what your politics are talking about, bro, because you know that's where everything lies, is with the
money. I agree, but be careful when you say these conservative people. Remember that the Dixiecrats in the South were all Democrats. Bull Connor was not a Republican, all right? Now, here's the point. I agree with you. If you're an idiot, it helps to have money. Money can cover up a lot of idiocy in the world. But here's the point. Recently, there was a Stanford sociologist who did a study. He was looking at California. He was trying to figure out why the Asian American students are doing so well, better than the white students in California. He did a comparative study of whites, blacks, Hispanics, Asian Americans, and he concluded that, look, that one of the reasons that the Asian American students do better is they study a heck of a lot harder. Now, here you have an explanation for why inputs, homework, are related to outputs, which is success in academia. Now, you can say, well, but why? Why do Asian Americans study harder? I think here the factors are complex. One factor, perhaps, that we would want to look at if we studied it would be something like family structure, because on average, if you have a two-parent family, it's much easier to supervise a child's homework, impose discipline, and so on. Now, what is the illegitimacy rate in the Asian American community? It's infinitesimal, 2 to 3%. In white America, it's a lot higher, 25 to 30%. In black America, tragically, much higher than that. So what I'm saying is, it is not unreasonable, and it shouldn't create an atmosphere of accusation to say, look, we have a difficult problem here. How do we address it? It begins with understanding and scholarship. Even if you have to raise some taboos to look at it, I think we'll come out better at the end.
Offerly, Kansas.
Yeah. Hi, Dinesh. You touched on it earlier, but I'd like to expand on the situation of abortion. I feel that, you know, one of the prime drivers of the liberal movement today is an attempt to cover up the facts of abortion and its relationship to historical lows in this country and elsewhere. One of the prime drivers behind slavery was the notion that Negroes were not people, and so they could be enslaved. And then again, later in the 20th century, the Nazi contention that Jews were not people, and the consequences of that. And now that the fetus or the baby prior to birth is not a person, and the notion that it's okay to kill them. I mean, it's commonly assumed that it's murder, but it's murder because we can draw a line. And so that if somehow we make abortion illegal and the crime that it is, that they will be forced to accept they are no better than slave owners or Nazis. And so their primary thrust in defeating conservatism is to hang on to that notion that somehow it is a moral thing to support abortion.
See, I would not make a direct equation between abortion equals Nazism equals slavery. I do want to say this. One of my favorite books is written by the political philosopher Harry Jaffa. It's called The Crisis of the House Divided. It's a study of the Lincoln-Douglas debates. They were basically debating the issue of slavery. Douglas, if you think about it, took a very interesting position which corresponds almost identically with the pro-choice position. Douglas didn't say he was for slavery. He said, I'm not for it and I'm not against it. I am for each state deciding for itself. Let each state vote up or down on slavery, and that should be the law of the land. In a sense, what Douglas was doing is arguing the same line that we hear today in the so-called abortion debate. Lincoln's argument is very interesting. Lincoln basically said, look, you, Douglas, are celebrating the principle of choice, but you cannot defend choice without regard to what is being chosen. Yes, if you are talking about people having the choice of between this and that, or going here or there for vacation, sure. But on the other hand, if you are having them choose whether or not a Negro is a human being, on that you don't get to choose. In other words, choice has got to consider what is being chosen. So I think that in a way there's a shallowness to the abortion debate, as though merely saying pro-choice settles the issue. Pro-choice about what? I think that that debate has been, unfortunately, not had in this democratic country because the Supreme Court has come marching in, has arrogated a moral decision that should be made democratically in the community, and has made it by fiat. I think this is, in a sense, a kind of illiberalism, inconsistent with what the founders wanted in a self-governing community.
Santa Fe, New Mexico. Hi.
Hello.
You're on the
Mr.
air.
D'Souza. I'm from Santa Fe, New Mexico, and I feel that your writing about racism in this country is entirely inappropriate. You're not from here. You came here at 17. You are not Frederick Douglass, nor are you Booker T. Washington. You are from India, right about the caste system. And I'm quite sure, by the way, I am a grandmother, a woman of color, and a psychologist by profession. And I listened to you. I've been listening to you from the first time you came on, and it's something very gnawing about your personality. And I felt that with many people. And I want to weigh in saying that I believe that your wife, I'm sure she's a white person. She's not Indian. She's not black, because you're the type who would marry a white woman, because you need that, because you had a problem with the caste system in your own country. So you need to think about writing about racism, black folks in this country, because you're really not there. It's not appropriate for you to do that.
Hey, look, the reason I married a white woman is I fell in love with her, okay? So you don't know anything about me. Let me tell you this. It's precisely because I come from a different country with its own history of prejudice. It has its own caste system. Fortunately, my family has been outside the caste system since we were converts outside of Hinduism, and the caste system is within Hinduism, that I'm able to make these kinds of cross-cultural comparisons in my work. A few years ago, I had the privilege of debating the Reverend Jesse Jackson at Stanford University. We were debating racism, and is America a racist society? And he was giving examples of racism, and I said, look, Reverend Jackson, look, it's a big country. I can find examples of racism too. But show me a racism today that is strong enough that it's preventing you or me or your children or mine from achieving the American dream. Where is that kind of racism? Show it to me. And the Reverend Jackson, you know, he hems and haws and plays with his mustache and so on. And finally he says, I can't show it to you, but that's not because it doesn't exist. The racism has gone underground. It used to be overt. It is now covert. And so in a sense, I was very baffled here because I said to myself, why do he and I, here are two of us, intelligent people, we have the same skin color, but we see the world so differently. He sees racism everywhere, and I see it talked about a lot more than I actually see it in reality. And I think the reason for this is that the immigrant perspective, the non-white immigrant perspective on America, is very different from that of the leaders of indigenous minority groups like Jackson. We come to America and we compare America to some other existing country. So we're using a comparative or historical standard of reference. Jesse Jackson isn't saying that America is terrible when you compare it to Ghana or Somalia or Ethiopia. He is comparing America to utopia. He is comparing America to the Garden of Eden, to perfection. He is holding America to its own high standard. So I think this is the reason why we see things differently. It's not because I'm evil and you're virtuous. It's because we're bringing different lenses into the camera and seeing the same set of facts through a different set of assumptions. So if you want diversity in American society, you're getting some of it with me.
Have you ever been discriminated against?
I certainly have, and I've certainly seen it. I also want to say that I think discrimination against blacks in America has a different thrust or a different complexion than that directed toward immigrants. Again, it comes back to that issue of inferiority. People may not like the Pakistani cab driver, or they're irritated by the foreigner, you know, go home and all that. What's interesting, by the way, is my book, The Enemy at Home, is producing an incredible outpouring of liberal racism. In other words, I'm getting all these emails that are of the tenor of go back to India and this sort of thing. And so, you know, liberalism, which you identify with open-mindedness and sort of tolerance for the outsider, you only have to scratch the surface, and I think a very vicious bigotry begins to push out. Anyway, the point I'm making here is I think I do a lot in the end of racism to distinguish between immigrants and African Americans, while also saying that there are things that, there are strategies of success that we have in common.
Have you seen a difference in this as Hispanics have become much more populated in the United States?
Well, Hispanics are a very interesting example of how the peculiar character of racism in America, because Hispanics are not a race. Hispanics are united really by speaking Spanish or the places they come from. But if you really look at it, the Cubans, the Mexicans, the Brazilians, very different history, different languages, sometimes different religion. We unite them in a simple category. Similarly with me, when I came to America, I suddenly found I was being called Asian American. I thought, wow, that's interesting. India and China, I never thought of us as having anything in common, very different histories and so on. But here, we all become Asian Americans. So our categories are very artificial. And now consider my daughter, who is in the middle. In fact, when she says when I was in the first grade, I was classified as African American. In my second grade, I was classified as Hispanic American. This year, I'm Asian American. She says, what am I? She reflects the difficulty in an increasingly multiracial society. And the Hispanics are a classic element of that, of not falling into this camp or that camp. The Hispanics are Western and they are non-Western. They straddle the divide, and even politically they have a choice. They can sort of adopt the strategy of agitate, 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 which has been the strategy of the civil rights leadership, or they can adopt the sort of immigrant strategy of navigate around the shoals of racism and claim your share of the American dream. Empirically, the second strategy works better.
South Carolina, Columbia, hello.
Hi, Dinesh. Thank you very much for being on the show, and Suzanne, thank you. Dinesh, what has the United States gained by not taking out the mullahs that are responsible for all of the radical Islam fanaticism? Why not go after them directly? And second of all, why not put in satellites and antennas everywhere in Iraq and just flood them with the kind of liberal news that we have to deal with here? It sure did a good job brainwashing the people of America into electing the Democrats this time. Why not do that over there?
Okay, well, two things. First of all, I think we should go after the radical Muslims in a two-fisted way. Ironically, the people who are blocking us from doing that is the left at home. Now, why is that? If you talk to people, in a sense, on the left camp, what they say is, oh, we're fighting the wrong war. We shouldn't be fighting in Iraq. We should be going after the guys who did 9/11. Now, I don't know if this is news, but the guys who did 9/11, most of them are dead. Yes, we can have the planners of the operation and so on, but if the war on terror is defined so narrowly, what about the guys who did the London bombing, the Bali bombing, the Madrid bombing? What about the hundreds of thousands of people coming out of the madrasas imbued with hatred of America, signing up for jihad? Is that not part of the war on terror, the Taliban revival in Afghanistan? So yes, it's a bigger problem. Bush has made a lot of stupid mistakes. He's fighting, in a sense, on one front, the military front. He hasn't opened up the diplomatic front at all. But on the other hand, at least give him the credit that he recognizes it's a systemic problem. You have to change conditions on the ground over there. Now, you're asking, how do you do this? And in a sense, your strategy is the one we are adopting. You know, the United States is bankrolling all kinds of media operations in Iraq. We also fund dissident media in Iran. Most of the dissident radio stations, from what I read, are playing rock music and rap music. Now, I'm not totally against it. There are Iranian young people who don't like the mullahs and they like this kind of music. Okay. But remember, in the 60s and 70s, that's not how we fought the Soviet Union. We had Radio Free Europe. We had Radio Liberty. We had Soviet emigres giving, providing information on constitutionalism, on limited government, on property rights, on the right of dissent. In other words, it was a war of ideas. We didn't try to bring the Berlin Wall solely by sending off Madonna.
Is the media liberal?
The media is, the established media is overwhelmingly liberal, and the proof of this is that the conservatives have had to resort to what you can call rebel media. If you look at the Fox News channel, or you look at talk radio, in the sort of bomb-throwing conservative media, the conservatives excluded from the mainstream media have had to run in a way to some of the more outsiders shooting in type of media. And I think it's been to the detriment of our political debate because the sort of high-level debate that we should be having is, in a sense, institutionally cut off. The same is true of the universities. Conservatives are excluded from the mainline universities. The kind of debate we've been having today, these kinds of arguments are often not heard on literally hundreds of American campuses. It's a very serious intellectual problem, quite apart whatever your political views.
You write in Illiberal Education that once liberals get into a university situation as professors, they actively keep conservatives out. What kind of, how do you prove that?
Well, you prove it in a way. Well, there have been some surveys and studies. The Chronicle of Higher Education, which is sort of an establishment magazine, does an annual survey of the political opinions of faculty. And if you focus on the humanities and the social sciences, because it doesn't really matter if you're a conservative in math, but if you focus on the humanities and social sciences, you do find a very lopsided distribution. And the more elite the campus, the worse the problem. When I was a student at Dartmouth, there were liberals on the faculty. They were the majority. But there were two kinds of liberals. There was the older liberal, whom I identify with the 50s and early 60s. Usually you recognized him because he wore a tweed jacket, he wore a tie. This kind of guy believed in free speech. He was liberal in his views, but he entertained rival views. It was a sort of a bigger-hearted liberalism. And then there was the new guys, the dissidents of the 60s, the activist left. They were coming to power. What is amazing to me is that today, when I go back to the campus, the speech codes are gone, political correctness, there is a sardonic disrepute that it's fallen into. That's good. The bad news is that that older generation of liberals, the big-hearted liberals, are gone, and the 60s generation is fully in charge. Now, these guys are more activist, and you have to realize that things have not gone their way. It's very bitter. because they expected, they were writing books in the 60s, there'll be Marxist revolutions all over the world, socialism will defeat capitalism, the contradictions of labor and capital will emerge. And so what's happened is the world hasn't gone that way. The Cold War has ended, the Sandinistas were ejected from power, although they're now back in, and the entrepreneur has come to center stage. So I think you have a lot of embittered liberals on the campus, and they basically say, look, even in Washington, despite this recent election, things haven't been going so well. The conservatives are setting the agenda. One more appointment that Bush has to the Supreme Court. Who knows what's going to happen? But they go, you know what? Here on the campus, we are in charge. We may not be able to put the Berlin Wall back up, but we can take over the English department. So there's a desire to sort of browbeat students into embracing the liberal view. And as I say, it's done very cunningly by identifying liberalism with intelligence itself. So the conservative is often feeling very beaten down. Sometimes people ask me, what is your mission in speaking on campus? And I say it's threefold. It's to embolden and give intellectual ammunition to the conservatives. It is to sway and help the guy in the middle to rethink his views. And it's to take the activist left that really can't be swayed and just flummox and bewilder those guys so they don't feel they have the full run of the place.
Bloomfield Hills, Michigan.
Hi, Dinesh. I'm really enjoying this program, and I've enjoyed your books over the years, and I'd like to extend a conversation you and I had about 6 or 7 years ago, and that conversation had to do with what Ronald Reagan would do in a particular situation. What would, in your judgment, and this is obviously speculation, but how would Ronald Reagan react to the war on terror? How would Ronald Reagan perceive the weaknesses in radical Islam? What would he do to exploit those weaknesses that perhaps President Bush and the President administration is not doing?
I'm sorry, caller. Thank you.
I think a bunch of things. Much as I admire Bush, I do think that he has some very serious weaknesses. One is he's a bit like the toy soldier who walks into the wall and keeps going. If you ask Bush, gee, what would you do about Iraq with all the information you have now? He goes, well, I'd do it exactly the same way. I don't think Reagan would say that. I think what Reagan would say is something like this. In retrospect, I might concede that I was wrong to invade Iraq when I did. In retrospect, I kind of wish I'd focused, not invasion, but focused on Iran. Iran was pursuing the weapons of mass destruction with the same determination as Saddam Hussein, but apparently with greater success. But you have to remember that no president gets to make a decision in retrospect. A statesman is in the moving current of events, and a statesman has to make decisions with information available at the time. So I think this kind of open-minded attitude, which is I didn't know these facts. I had to weigh competing risks. Yes, I had to look at what if I invaded Iraq and was wrong, but I had to weigh that against what if I did nothing and was wrong? What if the radical Muslims were able to get their hands on a big bomb and it went off in Chicago and 25,000 people were killed? Who would take the responsibility then? So that's the point. I wish Bush was more flexible. I think he's fighting too much a one-dimensional military campaign. He should be fighting on the diplomatic front, in a sense, to wean away the traditional Muslims to the radicals. In The Enemy at Home, I give 5 ways to do that. I think that opens up a totally new strategy in the war on terror.
Columbia, Maryland.
Oh, hello, Connie and Mr. Dinesh. I have a comment and 3 questions for you. Thanks to your darling Ronald Reagan, who deregulated the airlines and FDA, and they're all in a mess. Do you ever plan to go back to India to live? If not, why? And to what country do you owe your citizenship, or maybe citizenships? When do you plan to challenge or write about a form of slavery, the caste system in India? And thank you very much.
Number one, I do write about the caste system in my book, The End of Racism. When I first came to Washington in the 80s, I looked around and I noticed a very interesting sight, which is that those of us who are, if you will, persons of color, non-white, we're often held to be experts basically on our own non-whiteness. So in other words, if you're black, you're asked your opinion on racism and the Rodney King beating and the O.J. Simpson verdict, but nobody cares what you think about the war in Iraq. And I didn't want to develop a career in America in which I would be Mr. Official Indian, giving the Indian viewpoint on everything. And so I said very prudently, I am not going to write about India at all, at least for a while. I'm going to develop an interest and expertise in other issues. And then in later life, once I have established that independence, I can always go back if I want and write about India, which I might still do. I am not, however, going to move back to India for this reason. Well, first of all, I've got my lovely wife, my beautiful daughter here. I have every reason to stay. I have very thoughtfully chosen American citizenship, not just foisted upon me. I didn't do it to get to work at the White House. I actually became a citizen after I left the White House. It was a deliberative decision to switch allegiances, and it's because I believe that America ultimately stands for the greatest idea in the world, which is the idea that belonging to a country is not simply a function of birth or blood. You could come to India, or you could come to India and live for 30 years. You could even take Indian citizenship, but you cannot become Indian. And the reason for this is that being Indian is a function of having brown skin and Indian parents. Similarly, you have immigrants going to Europe, the Pakistanis in England, the Turks in Germany, the Algerian Muslims in France. They cannot become French or become German or become English very easily, because in those countries too, membership is a function of blood and birth. The beauty of America is that people can come here from all over the world. At one time it was the Irish, the Italians, and the Jews. Today it may be the Pakistanis or the West Indians or the Koreans. And it sometimes takes a couple of generations, but we can all become American. We become American by embracing the American way of life, by embracing the pursuit of happiness, by embracing, if you will, the Constitution and its promise of a better life. So I believe in that promise. I want it very much for my family and succeeding generations. So like it or not, I'm afraid I'm here to stay.
Did you have the option of a dual citizenship?
You know, I'm not sure if that's even offered. I think at the time I did not. And I also felt, quite honestly, that here I was, having worked in the American government and so on, I should make a thoughtful choice. Now, there are a lot of Indians who are actually moving back to India today. There's a lot of economic opportunity in India. In fact, for entrepreneurs, they say that India is the new Wild West. There is more opportunity there than here. On the other hand, I have sort of cast my lot in with this country and very much believe that America remains the underestimated country, the last best hope on earth.
Batavia, Illinois. Hello.
Hello. I want to ask you about our university system and the lack of freedom. We know that David Horowitz is sponsoring a bill of academic freedom where conservatives and people, you know, who have other thoughts can actually speak without getting a pie thrown in their face. We know that some professors these days, you know, advocate conspiracy theories, advocate anti-Semitism, advocate Israel bashing, along with the American hating. Do you think tenure outlived its usefulness? You know, and I also have a question about the American left, or the left in general, and its response to 9/11. They seem to identify a lot with so-called third worlders. In other words, if you're a dark-skinned fella, you must be right. I mean, there's like a nobility, you know, in this type of thing. We see Jimmy Carter making ridiculous statements, you know, about Israel, about Jews, you know, bordering on the anti-Semitic. You know, why? Because the Palestinians are you know, dark skin or something like that, and you know, and so far they must be right. What's going on with this type of logic? It's not. It's so logic.
Well, some of it, look, we sometimes try to find motives when the motives are apparent. I think that a lot of these professors, and I debate them all the time, are simply educated way beyond their intelligence. And what I mean by this is that you have guys who are in one field, who know something about that field, authoritatively pronouncing on every subject from Islam to the third world to the causes of Mossadegh's ouster in Iran. It's unbelievable. I turn on the television today, I'll see some sociologist from Bates College, you know, he says, the Iraqis are very upset with us being over there. The Iraqis feel we don't belong there. The Iraqis think this, the Iraqis think that. I'm thinking, how do you know? Name two. How can we discern the opinions of the Iraqi people without consulting them? Why don't we look at the results of the Iraqi election? How do you determine what a country thinks except by consulting its elected representatives? So what I'm getting at here is you have an enormous amount of foolishness masquerading under the guise of scholarship. And I think that this is why we very much need this disinfectant of open debate. It won't resolve anything, but it sometimes brings some of these truths to light and helps us slowly make our way forward.
And again, your next book is?
My next book, out from Regnery, probably the end of the year or in the fall, is called What's So Great About Christianity. It's a secular book, but it looks at the impact of Christianity in shaping Western civilization and answers some of the sort of polemical atheists like Dawkins and others who have been writing very sophisticated attacks in the last year or so.
And the book after that?
I don't know.
How do you find out?
Well, the way I work is I think of ideas. A book is a big commitment of time. It takes a year, and for me on the average 2 years to do a book. So it's a small piece of my life, and I have to find a subject that is intellectually invigorating for me. Then I make sure that it has the public policy impact that it should have, and I sit down with my publisher. My publishers usually are interested in a book that sells. They don't want a book on Gnosticism in the 4th century or a book on chess. They want a book that's going to be about current issues that will find a market. And so between my intellectual interests and my sort of publisher's desire to have a book that has current impact, we find a book that works for both of us, and then I go for it.
Dinesh D'Souza has a website of his own. It's www.dineshdsouza, is that correct?
Right, no apostrophe. It's just DINESHDSOUZA.com.
What can people find there?
Well, it's kind of a gallery of all my books. You can get a preview of what the books are like. I put up a whole bunch of articles up there. So, in other words, sometimes in the give and take of debate, this way you can see my ideas as they are laid out. You can certainly order my new book, The Enemy at Home, which I think is certainly timely and fresh.
And you can also email to you at Dinesh J. Is that
my middle initial J, Dinesh J. D'Souza
at AOL.com.
I like to hear from my critics, and I certainly do.
Dinesh D'Souza, our guest on In Depth this month. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
In Depth with Dinesh